The conversion engine. How to turn attention into decisions and decisions into lifetime customers. By Bradley J. Sugars, founder and CEO Action Coach. Introduction. Conversion starts before conversation. There was a time when selling began the moment you spoke to someone. You picked up the phone, walked into a meeting, or greeted a customer at the door, and that was where the sale started. What happened next depended on your ability to present, persuade, and close. The stronger your pitch, the better your results. The sharper your objection handling, the more deals you won. That model worked in a world where information was scarce and the salesperson controlled access to it. But that is no longer the world we operate in. Today, by the time you speak to a customer, something far more important has already happened. They have seen your brand, heard your name, read about your work, or formed an opinion, often without you even knowing it. They may have researched alternatives, compared options, watched videos, read reviews, or asked others for advice. In many cases, they have already decided whether they trust you before you ever say a word. That changes the role of selling completely. Because if you believe the process starts when the conversation begins, you are entering far too late. The reality is simple. Conversion starts before conversation. It begins the moment someone becomes aware of a problem. It continues as they explore solutions, compare options, and form opinions. It is shaped by everything they see, hear, and experience, long before a salesperson is involved. Even in outbound situations where you initiate the contact, you are not starting from zero. The person you are speaking to already has beliefs about your industry, assumptions about your offer, and experiences that influence how they respond. You are not beginning the process. You are stepping into one that is already in motion. And that changes everything. It means your role is no longer to convince people. It means you are not there to push or pressure a decision. Your role is to understand, guide, and help someone move forward with a decision they are already trying to make. This is what this book is about. Not selling as an event, but conversion as a system. For years, I have taught business owners that growth comes down to a small set of numbers. Leads, conversion rate, number of transactions, average sale, and margin all combine to determine the outcome of a business. Improve any one of them and the business grows. Improve several and the results compound. But within that equation, one factor is consistently misunderstood. Conversion. Most people treat conversion as a moment, a meeting, a pitch, a close, something that happens in real time, face-to-face, or over the phone. It is not just that anymore. Conversion is a process. It unfolds across time, across interactions, and across multiple touch points. It happens in the mind of the customer long before it becomes visible in a transaction. It is influenced by trust, clarity, relevance, timing, and confidence. And most importantly, it can be designed. Now, that is the idea behind the conversion engine. The conversion engine is not a script or a technique. It is a structured way of understanding how people move from awareness to decision and from decision to long-term value. It connects marketing, sales, and systems into a single integrated process. It reflects how people actually buy today. It shows you where conversion really happens, and it gives you a way to influence that process without pressure, without manipulation, and without relying on outdated sales tactics. As you read this book, you will notice something important. There's very little focus on closing in the traditional sense. That is deliberate. Closing is not where conversion happens. It is simply where the decision becomes visible. When everything leading up to it is right, the close is natural. When it is not, no technique will fix it. Throughout this book, we will explore how buying has changed, why traditional approaches are failing, and what needs to replace them. We will break down the stages of conversion from first engagement through to diagnosis, decision, follow-up, and long-term growth. We will look at inbound and outbound not as separate disciplines, but as entry points into the same system. And most importantly, we will build something far more valuable than a set of skills. We will build a system that works consistently, a system that scales, a system that turns attention into decisions and decisions into lifetime customers. If you take one idea from this introduction and carry it with you through the rest of the book, let it be this. Selling is not something you do to people. Conversion is something you build for them. And once you understand how to build it, everything changes. Part 1, the truth about buying today. Buying has changed, but most businesses haven't. Customers are more informed, less predictable, and further along in their thinking before you ever speak to them. To improve conversion, you must first understand how decisions actually happen today. Because if you misunderstand the buyer, everything else breaks. Chapter 1. The Death of Traditional Sales. For decades, sales operated on a simple premise. The person with the information held the power. If you wanted to buy something, you had to speak to someone who understood it. Whether it was a product, a service, or a solution, the salesperson was the gateway. They explained the options, answered the questions, and influenced the decision. In that environment, selling was about control. Control of the conversation, control of the information, control of the process. And success depended on how well you used that control. The best salespeople presented clearly, handled objections confidently, and closed decisively. Entire industries were built around teaching these skills, and for a long time they worked. But that model relied on one condition: information scarcity, and that condition no longer exists. Today, information is everywhere. Customers no longer need a salesperson to understand what they are buying. They can research independently, compare alternatives, read reviews, watch demonstrations, and gather opinions from people they trust, all without ever revealing themselves as a potential buyer. The balance of power has shifted. The buyer now has the advantage. And when the buyer has the advantage, the role of the salesperson must change. One of the most common reactions to this shift has been to push harder. More calls, more follow-ups, more urgency, more pressure. The assumption is that if buyers are harder to convert, the answer must be more effort. In reality, that approach makes things worse. Modern buyers are not resistant to buying. They are resistant to being sold in a way that feels outdated. They do not respond well to pressure without context, to pitches without understanding, or to conversations that ignore everything they already know. They are not looking to be convinced. They are looking to be confident. They want to feel that they are making the right decision based on clear thinking, relevant information, and trust in the person guiding them. That is a very different requirement from the traditional sales model. At the same time, it is important to be clear about something. Selling has not disappeared. There is still a need for proactive outreach. There are still opportunities that must be created. There are still customers who will never raise their hand unless someone reaches out first. Outbound selling is not dead, but bad outbound selling is. The kind that interrupts without relevance, pushes without understanding, and treats every prospect as if they are starting from zero is rapidly becoming ineffective. Because even in outbound situations, the same principle applies. You are not starting the conversion process. You are stepping into it. Every prospect already has context. They have beliefs about your industry, experiences with competitors, and assumptions about what you represent. They are not blank slates, and the faster you recognize that, the more effective your approach becomes. The goal of outbound selling is no longer to close the deal in the first interaction. It is to earn the right to the next step, to create enough relevance, interest, and trust that the prospect chooses to continue the process with you. This is the real shift that defines modern sales. From controlling the process to understanding it, from pushing decisions to guiding them, from isolated interactions to structured systems. The businesses that adapt to this shift are the ones that grow, not because they work harder, but because they work differently. They stop relying on individual talent and start building systems that produce consistent results. They stop focusing on what happens in a single conversation and start focusing on everything that leads up to it. Because once you understand how buying works today, the next step becomes obvious. You must design for it. You must build a system that aligns with how people actually make decisions. You must build a conversion engine. And once you do, something important happens. Selling stops being something you chase and starts becoming something that happens naturally as a result of the systems you've built. Chapter 2. Conversion starts before conversation. Most people think conversion happens at the end of a meeting, at the end of a pitch. At the moment a customer says yes, signs an agreement, or makes a payment. But that's not where conversion happens. That's where it becomes visible. By the time a decision shows up in the real world, most of the work has already been done, quietly, internally, and often without you being part of it. Think about the last time you made a meaningful purchase. Not something small or impulsive, but something that required thought. A service, a program, a piece of equipment, or a strategic decision in your business. By the time you spoke to someone, or even clicked buy, you had already formed an opinion. You had already decided what you liked and didn't like. You had already ruled options in and out. You had already leaned in a direction. In many cases, you were already convinced. All that remained was confirmation. This is how buying works now. And once you see it, you cannot unsee it. Customers are not deciding in a single moment. They are moving through a series of small decisions long before anything becomes visible on your side of the process. A decision to pay attention, a decision to explore further, a decision to trust what they are seeing, a decision to believe that a solution might work. Each of these decisions moves them forward or stops them from doing so. And most of them happen without you. This is why so many sales efforts feel harder than they should. Not because the product is wrong, not because the conversation is weak, but because the salesperson is trying to influence a decision that is already taking shape. They are responding too late. They assume they are starting at the beginning, when in reality, they're stepping into the middle. This applies just as much to outbound as it does to inbound. It is easy to believe that when you reach out to someone who has never heard of you, you are starting from zero. But the moment you contact them, a process begins instantly in their mind. Who is this? Why are they contacting me? Is this relevant? Is this worth my time? Those questions are answered in seconds, not through your full explanation, not through your full pitch, but through the first impression you create. In other words, even when you initiate the contact, you are not creating the decision process. You are activating it. This is where most people get it wrong. They treat conversion as something they do. In reality, conversion is something the customer experiences. It is their thinking, their interpretation, their confidence or lack of it. Your role is not to control that process. Your role is to understand it and influence it at the right moments, to recognize where the customer is in their thinking, to respond to that position, not your script, to provide clarity when they are uncertain, to reinforce confidence when they are close. When you do that, something important happens. The decision becomes easier. And when the decision becomes easier, conversion increases. This also explains why timing and responsiveness matter so much. When someone reaches out or responds to you, they are in a moment of active thinking. Their attention is engaged. Their curiosity is present. Their decision process is moving. If you respond effectively, you stay inside that moment. If you delay, you fall outside of it. And once you fall outside of it, the process continues without you. They explore alternatives. They lose urgency. They shift focus. And the opportunity disappears, not because they chose something else, but because the momentum was lost. This is why conversion is not about a single interaction. It is about staying aligned with the customer's thinking as it evolves. Because that thinking is not static. It moves, it strengthens, it weakens, it accelerates, it pauses. And that leads to the next layer of understanding. If conversion is happening before and between conversations, and if it is driven by a series of internal decisions, then the process itself is not as simple as we've been taught. It is not linear, it is not predictable, and it does not move in a straight line. To understand how to influence it, you need to understand how it actually behaves. That's where we go next. Chapter 3, the 2080 shift. There was a time when most of the work in business growth happened inside the sales conversation. Marketing existed, but its role was limited. It created awareness, generated interest, and produced opportunities. Once a prospect engaged, the responsibility shifted almost entirely to the salesperson. Their ability to build rapport, present clearly, and close effectively determined the outcome. In simple terms, the balance looked like this: 20% marketing, 80% sales. Marketing opened the door. Sales did the work. That model made sense in a world where buyers relied on salespeople for information. The conversation was where understanding was built, options were explored, and decisions were made. But that balance has changed dramatically. And today, much of the thinking that used to happen inside the sales conversation now happens before it. Customers arrive informed. They have explored options, compared alternatives, and formed initial opinions. In many cases, they are no longer trying to understand what exists. They are trying to decide what fits, which means the weight of influence has shifted, not slightly, fundamentally. The new balance looks closer to this: 80% pre-conversation influence, 20% in-conversation decision. Now, it's important to understand what this really means. This is not about marketing versus sales. It is not about departments or roles. It is about where decisions are being shaped. If most of the thinking happens before the conversation, then the conversation itself changes. It becomes less about persuasion and more about alignment. The customer is no longer asking, what are my options? They're asking, does this make sense for me? If you approach that moment as if it still carries the full weight of persuasion, you will overcompensate. You will explain too much. You will push too hard. You will try to fix uncertainty that has already formed elsewhere. And the customer will feel it. At the same time, this shift does not make sales less important. It makes it more precise. Because while the conversation may represent a smaller portion of the process, it is still the point where decisions are confirmed. It is where uncertainty is resolved, confidence is tested, and direction becomes action. It is the critical 20%. This is where many businesses get stuck. They either cling to the old model, relying too heavily on sales to carry the outcome, or they swing too far in the other direction, assuming that if marketing does enough work, the sale will take care of itself. Neither approach works, because conversion does not sit on one side or the other. It sits in between. Think of it this way. Everything that happens before the conversation shapes the customer's thinking. Everything that happens during the conversation shapes their decision. Conversion connects the two. It ensures that what the customer has already seen, heard, and experienced aligns with what happens when they engage directly. When that alignment exists, decisions feel natural. When it doesn't, friction appears. This is why increasing leads alone rarely solves a growth problem. You can generate more inquiries, more calls, more messages, but if the process that follows is not aligned, the results do not improve. Leads do not create growth. Conversion does. At its simplest level, the relationship looks like this. Leads times conversion rate equals customers. Most businesses focus on the first number, but the second number determines the outcome. If you generate 100 opportunities and convert 10%, you create 10 customers. Improve that conversion rate to 15%, and you now have 15 customers without increasing your leads at all. That is a 50% increase in output created purely through improvement in process. This is where the real leverage sits, because conversion does not operate in isolation. It multiplies everything else. More customers create more opportunities for repeat business. Higher engagement increases transaction frequency. Better alignment improves average sale and margin. Small improvements applied consistently compound across the system. This is where growth becomes exponential, not through dramatic changes, but through incremental improvements that reinforce each other. So the question is no longer, how do we get more leads? The better question is, how do we improve the system that turns opportunities into decisions? That shift changes how you think about everything. Instead of adding more input, you refine output. Instead of chasing volume, you improve efficiency. Instead of pushing harder, you build smarter. And once you begin to see conversion this way, something else becomes clear. The process itself is not as controlled as we often assume. Even if you build a strong system, even if you align marketing and sales, even if you improve every stage, the customer is still not moving in a straight line. They hesitate, they pause, they move forward, then backward. They accelerate, then slow down. In other words, the process you are trying to influence is not linear. And until you understand that, you will continue to misread what is happening inside it. That's where we go next. Chapter 4, the nonlinear buyer. For years, we've been taught to think of buying as a straight line, a funnel. At the top, people become aware. Then they move to interest, then desire, then action. Step by step, predictable and controlled. It's a clean model. It's easy to understand. And in theory, it makes perfect sense. There's only one problem. That's not how people actually buy. Think about your own decisions. Have you ever been certain you were going to buy something, only to hesitate at the last moment? Have you ever lost interest completely, only to come back weeks or months later and decide it was exactly what you needed? Have you ever moved quickly toward a decision, then slowed down, and then suddenly accelerated again? Of course you have, because buying is not linear. It is emotional. It is influence. And more often than not, it is messy. People do not move through a funnel. They move more like a game of snakes and ladders. Sometimes they move forward quickly when something builds confidence. Sometimes they pause when life gets in the way. Sometimes they move backward when doubt appears, and sometimes they disappear completely, only to re-enter the process later from a completely different position. What looks like inconsistency from the outside is simply the reality of how decisions are made. This is where most businesses misread what is happening. They assume that once someone reaches a certain stage, they will continue moving forward. They interpret hesitation as disinterest. They interpret silence as rejection. They assume the opportunity is lost when, in many cases, it is simply paused. The problem is not the customer. The problem is the model. When you try to force a linear framework onto a nonlinear process, you will always feel out of sync. Because customers are not following your process. They are following their emotions and their thinking. And that thinking moves. A customer might notice your brand, ignore it for a while, then return later with interest. They might explore options, get distracted, come back through a referral, hesitate again, and finally decide weeks or months after the initial interaction. At any point in that journey, they can move forward, backward, or sideways. And every movement is driven by one thing, perception. When perception improves, they move forward. When perception declines, they move backward. When perception becomes unclear, they pause. This is the real mechanism behind conversion. Not stages, not steps, but perception. This is why understanding the nonlinear nature of buying is so important. Because once you see it, you stop reacting emotionally to what looks like inconsistency. You stop assuming that every delay is a problem. You stop trying to force movement where it is not ready. Instead, you begin to respond more intelligently. A pause is no longer a failure. It is a moment where clarity is missing. A step backward is not rejection. It is a signal that confidence has dropped. Re-entry is not unusual. It is part of the process. And when you respond to those moments correctly, the process continues. This also changes how you think about timing. In a linear model, timing is something the seller controls. You move the customer through stages based on your process, your pipeline, and your urgency. In reality, timing is controlled by the buyer. They move when they are ready. They pause when they are uncertain. They accelerate when confidence increases. Your role is not to control that timing. Your role is to influence it. And the way you influence it is not by pushing, it is by removing friction. Friction shows up in different ways. Sometimes it is a lack of clarity. Sometimes it is a lack of trust. Sometimes it is uncertainty about the outcome. Sometimes it is simply too many options. Every time friction increases, movement slows. Every time friction is reduced, movement becomes easier. This is where the conversion engine becomes powerful. Instead of trying to force customers through a fixed path, you build a system that supports movement in any direction. You create touch points that build trust, interactions that create clarity, and conversations that help the customer make sense of their situation. You stay present as their thinking evolves. This applies just as much to outbound as it does to inbound. When you reach out to someone, you are not placing them at the top of a funnel. You are entering their world at whatever point they are currently in their thinking. They may be unaware. They may be considering options. They may be close to deciding, or they may not be ready at all. Your first job is not to sell. It is to understand where they are. If you treat every prospect the same, you miss this completely. You push too early, or you slow someone down who is already ready to move. In both cases, you create friction. The best salespeople are not those who move people through a process. They are those who can read position, they recognize signals, a question that shows curiosity, a hesitation that reveals doubt, a delay that indicates uncertainty, and they respond accordingly. This is why rigid systems fail. Not because systems are wrong, but because they are applied too strictly. A system should guide you, not trap you. The conversion engine is designed to work with this reality. It gives you structure, but it also gives you flexibility. It ensures you don't miss critical steps while still allowing you to adapt to the individual. If you take one idea from this chapter, let it be this. Buyers do not follow your process. Your process must follow them. Let them learn and become educated in their way. Once you understand that, everything becomes easier. You stop trying to control movement and start supporting it. You stop forcing decisions and start enabling them. And you stop seeing hesitation as a problem and start seeing it as part of the journey. But there is another layer to this. It's not just that buyers move in different directions. They also move at different speeds. Some decide quickly, some take time, some accelerate, then slow down. Some pause, then suddenly act. And if you don't understand what controls that speed, you will constantly feel out of sync with the decision. That's where we go next. Chapter 5, the speed of buying. If buying is not linear, it is also not constant. It does not move at a single, predictable pace. Some people decide quickly. Others take time. Some move fast at the beginning, then slow down. Others appear slow, then suddenly act with urgency. From the outside, it can feel inconsistent, almost random. It isn't. There are patterns behind speed. And once you understand them, you stop guessing and start responding with precision. One of the biggest frustrations in sales is timing. You meet someone who seems engaged, interested, even ready, and then nothing happens. They delay, hesitate, or disappear. On the other hand, you sometimes meet someone who moves so quickly you barely have time to process the conversation before they decide. The difference is not luck. It is how the buyer processes decisions. At one end of the spectrum, you have people who move quickly. They recognize a problem, trust their instincts, and want a solution now. They are not looking to explore every possibility. They are looking to move forward. When someone like this enters your world, the opportunity is immediate. But speed comes with a condition. If you match it, you win. If you slow it down, you lose it. Over-explaining, adding unnecessary steps, or introducing friction at this stage does not increase confidence. It interrupts momentum. And once momentum is interrupted, it is difficult to regain. At the other end of the spectrum, you have people who move more deliberately. They are not resistant to buying. They are resistant to making the wrong decision. They want to understand the full picture, reduce risk, and feel certain before moving forward. In a world of abundant information, this often leads to hesitation. Not because they lack interest, but because they have too many options, too many perspectives, and too much to process. This is where many salespeople make a critical mistake. They treat all buyers the same. They apply the same pace, the same structure, and the same expectations, regardless of who they are dealing with. And that creates friction. With a fast buyer, friction comes from slowing them down. With a slower buyer, friction comes from pushing too quickly. In both cases, the result is the same. The decision stalls. The goal is not to control speed. The goal is to align with it and guide it. But there is another dimension to speed that is even more important. It has nothing to do with the buyer. It has everything to do with you. In today's environment, one of the most powerful advantages in conversion is speed of response. Not price, not product, not even brand. Speed. Think about how many times you have reached out to a business and received no reply, or a delayed reply, or a response that felt generic and disconnected. What did you do? You moved on. Not because the solution wasn't relevant, not because the offer wasn't valuable, but because the moment passed. Momentum is everything in conversion. When someone reaches out, whether inbound or in response to your outreach, they are in motion. Their thinking is active. Their attention is focused. Their curiosity is engaged. That moment is valuable, and it is fragile. If you respond quickly and effectively, you stay inside that moment. If you delay, you fall outside of it. And once you fall outside of it, the process continues without you. Someone else responds. The urgency fades. The decision shifts. This is why, in many cases, the first meaningful response wins. Not the cheapest, not the most experienced, the one that shows up when the buyer is thinking. Of course, speed alone is not enough. A fast response that lacks relevance does not build connection. It simply acknowledges the interaction without moving it forward. But a fast, relevant, thoughtful response, that is powerful. So now you have two dimensions of speed working at the same time. The buyer's speed and your speed. Your role is to bring them into alignment. When the buyer is moving quickly, you remove friction and maintain momentum. When the buyer is moving more slowly, you provide clarity and reduce uncertainty. In both cases, you respond in a way that keeps the process moving forward. And beneath all of this sits a third factor. Confidence. Speed is not just about personality. It is not just about urgency. It is about certainty. People move faster when they feel confident. They slow down when they feel uncertain. Confidence comes from understanding the situation, trusting the person guiding them, and believing that the outcome will be positive. Every time you increase confidence, you increase speed. Every time you create doubt, you reduce it. This is why the earlier stages of the conversion engine matter so much. When the problem is clear, movement increases. When the gap is understood, urgency grows. When the path forward makes sense, hesitation reduces. Speed is not something you force. It is something you enable. There is also an important distinction to make. Not all delays are negative. Some delays are part of the process. People need time to think, to discuss, to reflect. They need to involve others, review details, and consider implications. The mistake is assuming that delay means disinterest. Often it means the opposite. It means the decision matters. Your role is not to eliminate delay. It is to manage it, to stay connected, to maintain relevance, to be present when the decision moves forward again. Because in a nonlinear process, speed is not constant. It accelerates, it slows, it pauses, and then it moves again. If you understand that, you stop trying to control timing, and you start managing momentum. And once you understand how buyers move and how fast they move, the next question becomes clear. How do you enter that process effectively? Because whether a customer comes to you or you go to them, the way you enter determines everything that follows. That's where we go next. Chapter 6, Outbound in a Conversion-First World. There's a dangerous myth in modern business that needs to be addressed early. It is the idea that outbound selling no longer works, that cold outreach is dead, that prospecting is outdated, that the only way to grow is to wait for people to come to you. It sounds appealing, it feels efficient, and in some cases, it is partially true. But as a complete strategy, it is flawed. Not every customer will raise their hand. Not every opportunity will appear through a search, a referral, or a piece of content. There are entire markets where the best opportunities are not discovered. They're created. In those environments, outbound is not optional. It is essential. The problem is not outbound. The problem is how most people do it. Traditional outbound selling was built on interruption. You called someone, got their attention, delivered your pitch, and tried to move quickly toward a decision. It worked when buyers had limited information and limited alternatives. But in today's world, interruption without relevance feels like noise, and people are very good at ignoring noise. Think about your own behavior. An unknown number calls your phone. A generic email lands in your inbox. A message appears that clearly was not written for you. Your reaction is immediate. You dismiss it, you ignore it, you move on. That is what most outbound activity feels like to the modern buyer. Not because they are not interested in solutions, but because the approach does not respect their context. This is the shift. Outbound no longer starts the conversion process. It interrupts it. When you reach out to someone, they are already in a mental state. They have priorities, pressures, assumptions, and ongoing decisions. Your message does not arrive in isolation. It lands inside that environment. And within seconds, they decide whether it matters. This is why most outbound fails. Not because the timing is impossible, not because the product is wrong, but because the message does not connect with where the buyer already is. Modern outbound has a different purpose. It is not to close. It is not to pitch. It is not to explain everything. Its purpose is far simpler and far more powerful: to earn the right to the next step. That step might be a reply. It might be a short conversation. It might be a moment of curiosity, but it is not the sale. Because in a conversion-first world, outbound is not about finishing the process. It is about entering it. This changes everything about how you approach it. Instead of trying to move someone from zero to decision in one interaction, you focus on moving them from where they are to the next logical stage in their thinking. That requires a different mindset. You're not trying to be impressive. You're not trying to be persuasive. You are trying to be relevant. Relevance is what creates attention, not volume, not persistence alone, but connection. When something you say reflects the person's situation, their role, or their priorities, something shifts. They pause. And that pause is the opportunity. From there, the goal is to create enough clarity and interest for them to continue. Not to commit, not to decide, but simply to stay engaged. This is where many outbound efforts break down. They try to do too much and move them too far too soon. They explain the product. They present features. They introduce pricing. They move straight into a pitch before the buyer has even decided whether the conversation is worth having. The result is predictable. Disengagement. The better approach is to simplify the objective. One interaction, one purpose. Move the conversation forward. That might mean asking a question that makes the person think. It might mean making an observation that feels specific and relevant. It might mean highlighting something that aligns with what they are already experiencing. Whatever form it takes, it must connect. Because connection creates permission, and permission is what allows the process to continue. This is also where outbound becomes multidimensional. It is no longer a single interaction, it is a sequence. A call might introduce the idea, a message might reinforce it. A piece of content might deepen understanding. A follow-up might bring it back into focus. Each interaction is small, but together they create movement. This is what we refer to as combination selling. Not because it is complex, but because it reflects reality. People do not engage in one place. They move across channels. They consume information in different ways. They respond at different times. Your role is to stay connected across that movement. Not aggressively, not intrusively, but consistently. When done well, something important happens. You become familiar. You become credible. You become a viable option. And once that happens, the conversation changes. Because now you are no longer interrupting the process. You are part of it. There's one more factor that determines whether outbound works. Speed. When someone responds, whether positively or even neutrally, that is a moment of opportunity. Their attention is active. Their curiosity is engaged. Their thinking is moving. If you respond quickly, you stay inside that moment. If you delay, you lose it. This is where many systems break down. They focus heavily on outreach but fail to support it with responsive follow-up. Messages go unanswered. Replies sit too long. Momentum fades. And what could have become a meaningful conversation disappears. The best outbound performers understand this. They do not just reach out. They are ready to respond. There's also a final shift in thinking that separates effective outbound from ineffective outbound. It is the difference between volume and relevance. More activity does not guarantee better results. More calls, more emails, more messages. If they are not connected to the buyer's reality, they simply create more noise. Relevance at scale is what matters. Consistent outreach supported by meaningful connection. When you approach outbound this way, it becomes far more effective and far less frustrating. You stop trying to force outcomes and start creating opportunities. And once someone steps into that opportunity, whether they came to you or you went to them, the process that follows is the same, and which brings us to the next step. Because now that we understand how buyers think, how they move, how they decide, and how we enter the process, it is time to define the system they move through. The conversion engine itself. Part 2 of the conversion engine. Conversion is not a moment, it's a system. When you understand the stages every customer moves through, you stop guessing and start guiding. This is where structure replaces chance, and where conversion becomes something you can design, manage, and scale. Chapter 7, the conversion engine explained. If your conversion is inconsistent, it is rarely because of effort. It is not because your team is not working hard enough. It is not because your market is too competitive. And it is not because opportunities are not there. It is because there's no structure guiding what happens between attention and decision. Most businesses do not have a conversion system. They have conversations, they have meetings, they have follow-ups, they have proposals, but they do not have a clearly defined pathway that moves a prospect from first interaction to final decision and beyond. And without that structure, results become unpredictable. Some conversations go well, others don't. Some prospects move forward, others stall, and no one can quite explain why. This is where the conversion engine changes everything. Because once you define the process, you can control it. Conversion is not a moment, it is a sequence. Every conversion follows a pattern. It does not matter what you sell, how long the sales cycle is, or whether the opportunity comes inbound or outbound. The structure of decision-making remains consistent. What changes is not the sequence, it is how well that sequence is guided. When there is no system, prospects move randomly. They skip steps, repeat steps, or drop out entirely. Conversations happen out of order. Important moments are missed. When there is a system, the process becomes clear. Every stage has a purpose. Every interaction has direction. Every step moves the customer forward. This is the conversion engine. Not a script, not a tactic, but a structured system that aligns with how people actually make decisions today. The 7 stages of the conversion engine. At its core, every conversion moves through the same stages, not always in a straight line, but always in the same underlying sequence. Entry, to engage, to diagnose, to guide, to convert, to nurture, to expand. Each stage represents a shift in the customer's thinking, not just what happens externally, but what happens internally. And understanding that internal shift is what gives you control over the process. 1. Entry, where they enter your world. Every conversion begins with context. A referral arrives with trust already in place. An inbound inquiry arrives with curiosity. An outbound interaction begins with skepticism. These are not small differences. They determine how the entire process unfolds. When you ignore entry point, you treat everyone the same and immediately create friction. When you recognize it, you align your response with where the customer is starting. And alignment is what creates movement. 2. Engage, turning attention into interaction. This is where most opportunities are lost. Not because businesses fail to respond, but because they respond without direction. Engagement is not about acknowledging the interaction. It is about advancing it. The goal is simple. Take attention and turn it into meaningful interaction. That requires 2 things. Speed, to stay inside the moment. Relevance, to create connection. Without both, the opportunity fades before it begins. 3. Diagnose, understanding what actually matters. This is where conversion truly begins. Not when you present, not when you pitch. When you understand, the customer is not buying your product. They are trying to solve a problem, close a gap, or improve a situation. Until that is clearly defined, there is no real reason to move forward. This stage is about depth, understanding where they are, where they want to be, and what is preventing them from getting there. Most salespeople rush this. The best stay here longer, because clarity at this stage determines everything that follows. 4. Guide, helping them make sense of the decision. Once the problem is clear, the next step is not to sell, it is to guide. At this point, the customer is no longer trying to understand the problem. They're trying to decide what to do about it. This is where structure matters. You help them compare options. You simplify complexity. You reduce uncertainty. You are not pushing toward a result. You're creating clarity around it. And when clarity increases, decisions become easier. 5. Convert, where the decision becomes visible. This is the moment most people focus on. The agreement, the payment, the commitment. But by the time you reach this stage, the outcome has largely been shaped. If the earlier stages have been done well, conversion is straightforward. If they have not, this stage becomes difficult. The close is not where conversion happens. It is where it shows up. 6. Nurture. What happens after the decision? Most businesses treat the sale as the finish line. It is not. It is the transition point. What happens immediately after the decision determines whether the relationship strengthens or weakens, whether the customer stays or leaves, whether they trust the decision or question it. Follow-up is not administration. It is conversion continuing. 7. Expand, where real value is created. The first sale is not the outcome. It is the starting point. This is where you build long-term value, repeat business, referrals, ongoing relationships. This is where conversion compounds, because a customer who stays, returns, and brings others into the process is far more valuable than one who buys once. The principle that changes everything. These stages are always happening. The question is whether you're guiding them or leaving them to chance. When there is no system, prospects skip steps, conversations lose direction, follow-up is inconsistent, opportunities fall through gaps. When there's a system, every prospect is guided. Every stage has purpose. Every interaction moves forward. That is the difference, not effort, structure. From conversation to system. Most businesses try to improve conversion by improving individuals. Better scripts, better training, better closing techniques. But individual improvement does not solve a structural problem. You do not scale people. You scale systems. The conversion engine is that system. It allows you to move from hoping conversations go well to building a process that works consistently. It gives you visibility, it gives you control, and most importantly, it gives you a way to improve. Because once the system is clear, you can see where it breaks. And when you can see where it breaks, you can fix it. Where we go next. Now that the structure is clear, the next step is to go deeper into each stage. Because while the system remains constant, the way you execute each part determines the outcome. And it all begins with where the customer enters. Because entry is not marketing. It is context. And context shapes everything that follows. Chapter 8, Entry Points. Context, not marketing. Every conversion starts somewhere. Not in a meeting, not in a pitch, not even in a conversation. It starts the moment someone enters your world. Most people assume this is a marketing issue. They think entry points are about lead generation, where the lead came from, what campaign worked, or which channel performed best. This isn't a book about marketing. I have written many others on that subject. But thinking about the marketing channel misses what really matters. Entry is not just about marketing. It is about context. Because when someone engages with you for the first time, they are not neutral. They arrive with a mindset already in place. A referral arrives with trust. Someone else has already validated you, and that changes how the customer sees you before you ever speak. They are more open, more receptive, and more willing to move forward. An inbound inquiry arrives differently. There's curiosity. They have taken action. They are exploring, comparing, and trying to make sense of what they need. They're somewhere between interest and consideration. An outbound interaction is different again. The customer did not ask to hear from you. Their default position is skepticism. They are deciding almost instantly whether this is relevant or whether it should be ignored. None of these are better or worse. They are simply different starting points. And that difference shapes everything that follows in the conversion engine. This is where most businesses go wrong. They treat every prospect the same. They respond to a referral as if trust needs to be built from zero. They handle an inbound inquiry as if the customer is not already thinking. They approach outbound prospects as if they are ready to engage. In doing so, they ignore the most important factor in early conversion, where the customer is starting from. If someone already trusts you, you do not need to build trust. You need to justify it. If someone is curious, you do not need to convince. You need to clarify. If someone is skeptical, you cannot assume anything. You need to earn relevance. When those distinctions are missed, friction appears immediately. And early friction is the most damaging kind, because it shapes how the rest of the interaction is experienced. This is why entry is not a small detail. It sets the pace, it sets the tone, it sets the direction. A referral allows you to move faster. An inbound lead requires clarity. An outbound prospect requires patience. The mistake is trying to force all three into the same process. The better approach is simpler. Meet them where they are. Not where your script starts, not where your pipeline says they should be, but where they actually are in their thinking. When you do that, something shifts immediately. The interaction feels more natural. The conversation feels more relevant. The next step feels easier, because instead of pulling them into your process, you are guiding them forward from theirs. This becomes especially important in outbound. When you reach out to someone, it can feel like you are initiating the process. But in reality, you are stepping into their world at whatever point they currently sit. They may already be considering a solution. They may have tried something before. They may have strong opinions about your industry, or they may not be thinking about it at all. Your first interaction reveals that. And how you respond to that moment determines whether they move forward or disengage. The biggest mistake at this stage is assuming too much, assuming they understand what you do, assuming they need what you offer, assuming they are ready to act. When those assumptions are wrong, friction increases. When friction increases early, everything becomes harder. The better approach is to stay curious, to observe, to ask, to listen, to understand the position before trying to move it. Because once you understand where someone is starting from, guiding them becomes far easier. And that is what this stage is really about. Not moving the customer, but positioning yourself correctly within their process. Truly finding out their real entry point. Because when that positioning is right, the next step becomes natural. And the next step is critical. Because once someone has entered your world, there's a moment, brief, fragile, and incredibly valuable, where attention can either turn into interaction or disappear completely. That moment is your first response. And how you handle it determines whether the opportunity continues or ends before it truly begins. Chapter 9, Engage, the first response. There's a moment in every conversion process where the opportunity is at its most fragile. It is not at the close. It is not at the proposal. It is not even during the main conversation. It is at the very beginning. The first response. This is the point where attention either becomes interaction or disappears completely. When someone reaches out to you or responds to your outreach, they are giving you something valuable, their attention. And attention does not last. In that moment, they are thinking about the problem. They are considering options. They are open to moving forward. But that state is temporary. If you respond well, you stay inside that moment. If you don't, you lose it. And once it is lost, it is very difficult to recover. This is why engagement matters so much. Not because it looks professional, not because it creates a good impression, but because it determines whether the process continues at all. Speed protects momentum. Momentum is what drives conversion. It carries a prospect from curiosity to conversation, from conversation to clarity, and from clarity to decision. And momentum is created in moments, not over time. When someone reaches out, they are in motion. Their thinking is active. Their attention is focused. Their curiosity is engaged. That moment is your window. If you respond quickly, you stay inside it. If you delay, you fall outside it. And when you fall outside it, the process continues without you. They move on. They get distracted. They explore other options. Not because they rejected you, but because the moment passed. Speed is not about impressing the customer. It is about preserving momentum. But speed alone is not enough. A fast response that lacks direction does not move the process forward. It simply acknowledges the interaction. And acknowledgement is not engagement. This is where most businesses fall short. They respond politely. They confirm receipt. They provide basic information. And then they wait. The conversation stalls. Strong engagement does something different. It creates movement. It takes the interaction and advances it, deliberately but naturally. It gives the customer a reason to continue. Engagement is about direction. The purpose of the first response is simple. Make it easy for the customer to take the next step. Not a big step, not a commitment, just the next step. That might be answering a question, clarifying their situation, or continuing the conversation. But it must move forward. This is where intent matters. A strong response always has a purpose. It is not just reactive, it is directional. It might highlight something relevant. It might ask a question that matters. It might guide the conversation into the next stage. But it never leaves the customer wondering what to do next. Because uncertainty slows movement. Clarity creates it. Most opportunities are lost here. Not because the offer is wrong, not because the customer is not interested, but because nothing happens next. A prospect reaches out. They receive a response, and then the interaction fades. No clear direction, no meaningful follow-up, no reason to continue. This is where conversion quietly breaks down, not later in the process. Right at the start, match the way they communicate. There's another factor that has become increasingly important, how the customer chooses to communicate. People no longer operate in a single channel. They message, email, call, and interact across platforms, and the way they reach out is not random. It reflects their preference. When you ignore that preference, you create friction. When you respect it, you create comfort. If someone messages you on Instagram, respond in a way that fits that channel. If they call, meet them there. If they email, continue naturally. You can guide the interaction over time, but forcing a shift too early often breaks the flow. And flow is what you're trying to create. Because when the interaction feels easy, the conversation continues. Engagement creates an opportunity. At this stage, you are not trying to sell. You are not trying to explain everything. You are not trying to move toward a decision. You are simply trying to create a meaningful interaction. Because without that, nothing else happens. Engagement is the gateway to everything that follows. When it is strong, the process builds naturally. When it is weak, the process never really begins. From one interaction to many. There's one more shift to understand. The first response is rarely the only interaction. In today's environment, conversations do not happen in a single moment or a single place. They unfold across time and across channels. A message leads to a call. A call leads to a follow-up. A follow-up leads to another interaction. Each step builds on the last. Or it doesn't. And that is where many businesses struggle. They treat each interaction as separate, a reset, a new attempt, instead of part of a connected process. But conversion is not built on isolated moments. It is built on continuity. And that is where the next level begins. Because once you understand how to create engagement in a single interaction, the next step is to connect multiple interactions into a single, consistent experience. That is where conversion starts to accelerate. Chapter 10, Combination Selling. Selling used to happen in a single place, a phone call, a meeting, a presentation. That was where everything happened. That was where decisions were made. Today, that model no longer reflects reality. Conversations do not happen in one place. They happen across time and across channels. A prospect might first see your name somewhere, then respond to a message, then visit your website, then take a call, then go quiet, then return weeks later through a different interaction. This is not unusual. It is normal. And if your approach is built around a single moment, you will constantly feel like you are starting over. This is where most sales processes break down. They treat each interaction as isolated. A call is a call. An email is an email. A message is a message. Each one is handled separately without connection to what came before. From the customer's perspective, this creates friction because every time they re-engage, it feels like the process resets. They have to re-explain. They have to rethink. They have to reorient themselves. And every reset slows the process down. Conversion requires continuity. Modern conversion is not built on individual interactions. It is built on connected ones. Each interaction should feel like part of the same conversation, not a new attempt to start one. When continuity is present, the customer experiences progress. They feel like they are moving forward, not repeating steps. And progress builds confidence. Confidence builds momentum. This is the real purpose of what we call combo selling, not complexity. Continuity, the role of multiple touch points. In a multi-channel world, no single interaction carries the full weight of the decision. Instead, influence is distributed. A call might introduce the idea, a message might reinforce it, a piece of content might deepen understanding, a follow-up might bring it back into focus. Individually, each step is small. Together, they create movement. This is where many people misunderstand the process. They focus on making each interaction perfect. But conversion is not built on perfection. It is built on consistency. A series of connected, relevant interactions will always outperform a single perfect one. Because each touch point builds familiarity, and familiarity reduces resistance. Staying present without being pushy. One of the biggest challenges in modern selling is balance. Stay too quiet and you are forgotten. Be too persistent and you create pressure. Combo selling solves this by shifting the focus. You are not trying to force a decision. You are staying present in the process. Each interaction has a purpose. To clarify, to reinforce, to guide, not to push. When this is done well, something subtle happens. You become part of the customer's thinking. Not an interruption, not an intrusion, but a consistent presence. And that presence is what keeps the process alive. From familiarity to trust. Trust rarely comes from a single interaction. It is built through repetition. Not repetition of the same message, but repetition of relevance. Each time the customer engages with you in a way that feels connected to their situation, your position strengthens. You become familiar. You become credible. You become a viable option. And once that happens, the dynamic changes. Because now the customer is no longer evaluating you from scratch. They are building on what already exists. That shortens the decision process. And it increases conversion. The mistake of disconnected effort. Most businesses are active. They make calls, they send messages, they follow up, but their efforts are disconnected. There's no thread linking one interaction to the next. So while activity is high, progress is low. This is why volume alone does not improve conversion. Without connection, activity becomes noise. The customer experiences each interaction as separate, and separate interactions do not build momentum. Structure creates flow. Combo selling does not mean doing more. It means connecting what you already do. It requires structure, knowing what happens next, knowing how each interaction builds on the last, knowing how to move the conversation forward, regardless of the channel. This is where the conversion engine supports the process. It provides the framework that allows interactions to connect, so that whether the customer engages through a call, a message, or a meeting, The experience feels continuous, not fragmented. Why this matters? Because without continuity, conversion slows down. With it, conversion accelerates. The customer feels progress. The decision feels easier. The process feels natural. And when the process feels natural, resistance drops from interaction to system. At this point, something important becomes clear. Conversion is not just about conversations. It is about how those conversations connect. And once you begin to connect them, you move into a different level of control. Because now you are not just influencing individual moments. You're shaping the entire process. And when you can shape the process, you can measure it. Because beneath all of this, movement, engagement, continuity, there is a structure that determines outcomes. And that structure can be understood in very simple terms. Numbers. That's where we go next. Chapter 11, Conversion Math, the Business Chassis. At some point, everything we've discussed becomes very simple. It becomes numbers. No matter what industry you are in, no matter what you sell, and no matter how complex your business feels, the outcome is driven by a small set of measurable factors. How many opportunities you have, and how many of those opportunities become customers. Strip everything else away, and the relationship looks like this. Leads times conversion rate equals customers. Most businesses focus heavily on the first number. More traffic, more inquiries, more calls, more messages. The assumption is simple. Increase opportunities and results will follow. Sometimes they do, but often they don't. Because opportunities on their own do not create growth. Conversion does, where the real leverage sits. If you generate 100 opportunities and convert 10%, you create 10 customers. Improve that conversion rate to 15%, and you now have 15 customers without increasing your leads at all. Nothing else changed. No additional marketing spend, no new product, no increase in activity, just a better process. That is a 50% increase in output. This is where most businesses underestimate the power of conversion. They assume meaningful growth requires large changes. More marketing, more people, more activity. In reality, small improvements in conversion create disproportionate results. Because conversion is not just another number. It is a multiplier, the system behind the numbers. Conversion does not exist in isolation. It sits at the center of a wider system. More customers create more opportunities for repeat business. Repeat business increases transaction frequency. Higher engagement increases average sale. Stronger positioning improves margin. Each element reinforces the others. And when multiple elements improve at the same time, the effect compounds. A small increase in leads, a small increase in conversion, a small increase in frequency, a small increase in value. Individually, each change feels minor. Together, they create exponential growth. This is the business chassis, the underlying structure that determines performance. And conversion is the point where that structure either works or breaks. Why more leads is not the answer. And when conversion is weak, everything becomes harder. You need more leads to achieve the same outcome. You spend more time chasing opportunities that do not progress. You experience more inconsistency in results. So the natural response is to increase activity, more outreach, more campaigns, more effort. But activity without conversion simply creates more noise. If you are feeding more opportunities into a system that is not working, and the result is frustration, the better question, instead of asking, how do we get more leads? Ask, how do we make better use of the opportunities we already have? That shift changes how you think about growth. You move from volume to efficiency, from effort to effectiveness, from input to output. And once you start improving conversion, something important happens. Everything else becomes easier. Marketing performs better. Sales conversations become more productive. Decisions happen faster. Revenue becomes more predictable. Seeing the system clearly. The real value of conversion math is not just the outcome, it is visibility. Once you begin to measure conversion properly, you stop looking at results in isolation and start looking at stages. Where are opportunities entering? How many engage? How many move forward? Where do they slow down? Where do they stop? These are not abstract questions. They're practical. And when you can answer them, patterns emerge. You begin to see where the system is breaking. Perhaps responses are too slow at the engagement stage. Perhaps conversations are not going deep enough in diagnosis. Perhaps decisions are unclear at the guidance stage. Perhaps follow-up is inconsistent. Each of these is not a sales problem. It is a conversion problem. From guessing to managing. Without measurement, improvement is guesswork. You rely on instinct. You react to outcomes. You make changes without clear direction. With measurement, everything changes. You can see where attention is needed. You can focus effort where it matters. You can improve specific parts of the system. You move from reacting to managing. And when you manage the system, you control the outcome. Numbers support judgment. This is not about reducing conversion to a spreadsheet. It is about using numbers to guide thinking, to bring clarity to what is happening, to remove assumptions, to make better decisions. Because the goal is not just to understand conversion, it is to improve it. The shift that changes growth. Once you see conversion as a system and measure it as one, growth stops feeling unpredictable. You are no longer hoping conversations go well. You are building a process that produces results, and that process can be refined, strengthened, scaled. Where we go next. Up to this point, we have looked at conversion from the outside, how buyers think, how they move, how the process behaves. Now we move to the most important part of all, understanding the customer, because numbers tell you what is happening, but understanding tells you why. And without that, improvement is limited. This is where sales actually happens, not in presenting, not in closing, but in diagnosing. And that is where we go next. Part 3, diagnosis, where sales really happens. Most sales are lost long before the close, not because of poor presentation, but because of shallow understanding. This is where clarity is created, urgency is formed, and real decisions begin. If you get this right, everything that follows becomes easier. Chapter 12 and the power of questions. If conversion has a turning point, it is not the close. It is not the presentation. It is not the moment the customer says yes. It is the moment you understand them properly. Everything before that leads to it. Everything after that depends on it. And that moment is created through questions. The default mistake. Most people enter a sales conversation with the same belief. Their job is to explain, to present, to show value, to make the case. So they talk about the product, they talk about the service, they talk about features, benefits, and outcomes. And while they are talking, something important is happening. They are guessing. Guessing what matters. Guessing what the problem is. Guessing what will move the customer forward. Sometimes they guess right. Often they don't. Questions remove guesswork. The moment you start asking the right questions, the entire dynamic changes. The conversation stops being about you and starts being about the customer. The focus shifts from what you are offering to what they are experiencing. And when that shift happens, clarity begins to form. That clarity is what drives conversion, because a customer who is unclear does not decide. A customer who is clear moves forward. Information versus understanding. There's a difference between gathering information and creating understanding. Most questions gather information. They collect facts. What do? What's your goal? What's the challenge? These are useful, but they are not enough. Understanding connects those facts into something meaningful. A customer might say they want to increase sales. That is information, but it is not understanding. Why do they want to increase sales? What is happening right now? What have they tried? What is the impact if nothing changes? These questions take the conversation deeper. They turn a general statement into something real. Depth creates movement. Most sales conversations stay on the surface. A question is asked, an answer is given. The conversation moves on, but the surface rarely creates urgency. It rarely creates clarity, and it rarely creates decisions. The deeper you go, the more the customer begins to see their situation clearly. Often that clarity is new to them. They may have felt the problem, but not fully understood it. They may have known something was wrong, but not seen the consequences. Your questions bring that into focus. And when something comes into focus, it becomes harder to ignore. The moment everything shifts. At some point in a strong conversation, something changes. The customer pauses. They reflect. They begin to articulate their situation in a way they haven't before. That moment matters because that is the moment they stop hearing you and start understanding themselves. They begin to take ownership of the problem. They feel the impact more clearly. They see the gap more realistically. They start thinking about what needs to change. And once that happens, the need for a solution becomes real. Not because you pushed it, but because they arrived at it. Questions create trust. There's another effect that is just as important. When you ask the right questions and genuinely listen, the customer feels understood, not at a surface level, but at a deeper level. And that is where trust is built. Trust is not built by explaining how good you are. It is built by demonstrating that you understand. Questions are how you demonstrate that. They show that you are not there to push a solution. You are there to find the right one. This changes how the customer sees you. You are no longer a salesperson. You are someone who can help. The rhythm of a great conversation. Effective questioning has a natural rhythm. At the beginning, questions are open. They invite the customer to speak. They make it easy to engage. As the conversation develops, questions become more focused. They explore specific areas. They begin to narrow the discussion. Eventually, questions become precise. They move toward clarity. They confirm direction. They prepare for decision. This progression mirrors how people think. They start broad. They explore. They narrow. They decide. Your role is to guide that process. Listening is the multiplier. Questions alone are not enough. Listening is what makes them powerful. Without listening, questions become mechanical. With listening, they become dynamic. You hear what matters. You notice what changes. You recognize what is important. It is not just the words, it is how they are said. The hesitation, the emphasis, the shift in tone. These are signals. And when you pick up on them, you know where to go next. This is when the conversation becomes real. Because you are no longer following a script. You are following the customer. The shift that changes everything. When you approach conversations this way, something fundamental changes. You stop trying to move the customer forward and start helping them move themselves forward. Let me say that again. It's that important. You start helping them sell themselves. That is where real conversion happens. Not through persuasion, but through realization, where this leads. Understanding the customer is the turning point. But understanding alone is not enough. Because not every problem leads to a decision. Not every situation creates urgency. The next step is to identify what actually drives action. And that is not the problem itself. It is the gap. The gap between where they are and where they want to be. That is what creates movement. And that is where we go next. Chapter 13, Identify the Gap. Not every problem creates a decision. That is one of the most important truths in conversion. Customers live with problems every day. They tolerate inefficiencies, accept frustration, and delay action far longer than most people expect. If problems alone drove decisions, every conversation would lead to a sale. They don't, because what drives a decision is not the problem itself. It is the gap, where decisions actually come from. Every customer exists in two places at once, their current reality and their desired future, where they are now and where they want to be. Between those 2 points is the gap, and that gap is what determines whether they act or delay. If the gap is small, the decision can wait. If the gap is unclear, the decision is postponed. If the gap is large and real, the decision becomes difficult to ignore. This is the foundation of gap selling. The gap already exists. Your role is not to create the gap. It is already there. Your role is to make it visible. Most customers are aware of their situation at a surface level. They know things are not where they want them to be, but they have not fully explored what that means. They have not connected the dots. They have not clearly defined the difference between what is happening now and what could be happening instead. So they stay where they are. Not because they are satisfied, but because the alternative is not clear enough to act on. Clarity creates urgency. When you bring the current reality and the desired future into focus and place them side by side, the gap becomes real. Not theoretical, not abstract. Real. And when it becomes real, something changes. The customer begins to feel it. They see the difference between what's happening and what could be happening. They recognize the cost of staying where they are. They understand the value of moving forward. This is where urgency is created, not through pressure, not through tactics, but through clarity. Why most sales conversations fail. Most sales conversations move too quickly. The moment a problem is mentioned, the salesperson jumps to a solution. They explain how they can fix it. They present what they offer. They try to move forward. But without a clearly defined gap, the solution has no weight. It becomes an option, not a necessity. And options are easy to delay, from interest to action. When the gap is clear, the conversation changes. The solution is no longer just something that sounds good. It becomes something that makes sense. It connects directly to what the customer wants. It addresses something that matters. It reduces something that is uncomfortable. This is when movement begins, because now you are no longer trying to convince. You are responding to something the customer already recognizes. Not all gaps are equal. Some gaps are small. They represent improvement, but not transformation. They create interest, but not urgency. The customer may move forward slowly or not at all. Other gaps are significant. They affect performance, outcomes, and direction in meaningful ways. They create tension. They create focus. These are the gaps that drive decisions. Part of your role is recognizing which type you are dealing with, because the size and clarity of the gap determines the speed of the process. Large, clear gaps accelerate decisions. Small or unclear gaps slow them down. The gap must be discovered. This is where many people make a critical mistake. They assume the gap is obvious. It isn't. What is clear to you is not always clear to the customer. What feels important to you may not feel important to them. The gap must be discovered, and then it must be clarified. This happens through questions, understanding the current reality in detail, exploring the desired future clearly, connecting the two in a way that makes the difference visible. When this is done well, something powerful happens. The customer begins to articulate the gap themselves. They explain what is not working. They describe what they want. They recognize the difference. And when they do that, the conversation becomes very different. From push to pull, you are no longer pointing out a problem. They are doing it for you. You are no longer creating urgency. They are feeling it. This is where conversion shifts from effort to flow, because the decision is no longer being pushed. It is being pulled. Logic and emotion. There is one more layer that cannot be ignored. The gap is not just logical, it is emotional. Customers do not act on logic alone. They use logic to justify decisions. But emotion is what drives them. The gap must connect to both. It must make sense, and it must feel important. When both are present, decisions happen. When one is missing, hesitation appears, bringing the gap to life. This is why the best conversations go beyond the surface. They do not stop at identifying the problem. They explore the impact. What happens if nothing changes? What does that mean for the business? For the team? For the individual? These questions bring the gap to life. They move it from an idea to something real. And once something is real, it becomes difficult to ignore. Where this leads. Once the gap is clear, the path forward becomes visible. But there is still one more layer to uncover, because not every problem is the real problem. And solving the wrong problem leads to the wrong outcome. Before you guide a decision, you need to identify what truly needs to be fixed. Not the symptom, the source. That's where we go next. Chapter 14, the broken bone principle. Not every problem is the real problem. That might sound obvious, but it is one of the most common reasons conversion fails, because what customers present is rarely what actually needs to be solved. The problem with surface problems, customers describe symptoms. We need more leads. Our team isn't performing. We're not hitting targets. These statements feel clear. They sound specific. They appear actionable. But in most cases, they are only the surface. They are the visible result of something deeper. And if you solve the symptom, you may create improvement, but you will not create transformation. The difference between relief and resolution. Imagine someone walks into a hospital with a headache. A poor diagnosis would treat the symptom. Pain relief, temporary comfort, short-term improvement. But a good doctor asks a different question. Why? Because sometimes a headache is just a headache, and sometimes it is something far more serious. The role of the doctor is not to treat the symptom. It is to find the cause. This is the broken bone principle. In business, the broken bone is the real issue. The one that, if left unresolved, continues to create problems, no matter how many symptoms you address. Why this matters in conversion. Most sales conversations stay at the surface. The customer describes a problem. The salesperson responds with a solution. On paper, it makes sense. But something feels off. The solution doesn't fully connect. The urgency isn't strong enough. The customer hesitates, not because they are not interested, but because the real issue has not been addressed. Finding the break. Your role is not to accept the problem. It is to investigate it, to go beyond what is said and uncover what is actually happening. Because in many cases, a lead problem is a conversion problem. A team problem is a structure problem. A revenue problem is a positioning problem. The surface tells you where to look. It does not tell you what to fix. Depth requires persistence. This is where most people stop too early. They ask one or two questions. They get an answer. They move forward. But the real issue sits beneath that first layer. Finding it requires persistence, not aggressive questioning, but curious questioning. What's actually causing that? Why has that not been resolved yet? What have you tried? What happened when you did? Each question takes the conversation deeper. And at some point, something shifts. The moment of realization. The customer pauses. They reflect. They see something they hadn't fully seen before. That moment matters because that is when the broken bone becomes visible. Not to you, to them. And when they see it, everything changes. The conversation becomes more focused. The urgency becomes real. The need for a solution becomes clear. Why most solutions don't land. When the broken bone is not identified, solutions feel incomplete. Even if they are technically correct, the customer may agree. They may understand. They may even say it makes sense. But they do not act because something doesn't feel fully aligned. The connection is not strong enough. When the problem is accurate, when you find the real issue, the dynamic changes. The solution aligns directly with what matters. The value becomes obvious. The decision becomes easier. Because now you are not solving a general problem. You are solving the problem. Precision creates confidence. This is not about making the problem bigger than it is. It is about making it accurate. Accuracy creates confidence. Confidence drives decisions. When the customer feels that the issue has been properly understood, they are far more willing to move forward. Avoiding the fast solution trap. One of the biggest mistakes in selling is solving too quickly. Hearing a problem and immediately offering an answer. It feels efficient, but it skips the most important step, understanding. Without that, even the best solution lacks impact because it is not anchored in the real issue. The balance. There is an important balance here. The goal is not to create discomfort for the sake of it. It is not to exaggerate problems. It is to ensure clarity. When the situation is clearly understood, decisions become natural, not forced, where this leads. Once the broken bone is identified, the path forward becomes far more precise. But there is still one more step before the decision, because understanding the problem is not enough. The customer must also see it clearly. They must experience it. They must engage with it. This is where most conversations fall short, because explanation alone is not enough. The next step is to involve the customer in discovering the solution. And that is where we go next. Chapter 15, Interactive Conversion Tools. Once the problem is clear, most sales conversations follow the same pattern. The salesperson starts explaining. They present the solution, they walk through features, they describe how it works, and they assume that clarity will come from what they say. But explanation alone rarely creates conviction, because the customer is still passive. They are listening, they are processing, they are trying to make sense of it, but they are not fully engaged in the decision. The shift from explanation to involvement. This is where most conversion slows down. Not because the solution is wrong, but because the customer has not experienced it. They have heard it, but they have not felt it. They have not seen how it applies to them. They have not arrived at the insight themselves. And that matters because people believe what they see, but they trust what they discover. Ownership changes everything. When a customer participates in the process, something changes. They are no longer being told. They are discovering. They answer questions. They evaluate their situation. They see patterns in real time. And in doing so, they move from observer to owner. That ownership is what accelerates conversion because the insight is no longer coming from you. It is coming from them. Making the invisible visible. Most customer problems are not obvious. They exist in patterns, behaviors, and systems that are difficult to see from the outside. This is why explanation often falls short. You can describe inefficiency. You can explain missed opportunities. You can highlight gaps. But until the customer can see it clearly, it remains abstract. Interactive tools solve this. They take what is unclear and make it visible. A scorecard shows where performance is breaking. An assessment reveals where time and effort are being lost. A structured questionnaire highlights patterns that were previously hidden. The difference is not in the information, it is in the clarity, from insight to decision. Once the customer sees their situation clearly, the conversation changes. There is less resistance, less questioning, less hesitation, because they are no longer relying on your interpretation. They are working from their own understanding. This is where decisions begin to move. Not because you push them, but because the path is now visible. Why tools accelerate conversion? Interactive tools like pricing tools and building tools and scoring tools do three things exceptionally well. They create clarity quickly. They involve the customer in the process. They build momentum. A well-designed tool can do in minutes what would otherwise take an extended conversation. It shortens the path from confusion to understanding. And once understanding is present, decisions become easier. Structure creates consistency. There's another advantage that is often overlooked. Consistency. Without tools, every conversation is different. Different questions, different depth, different outcomes. With tools, the process becomes repeatable. Every customer experiences the same level of discovery. Every situation is evaluated through the same lens. Every conversation is built on the same foundation. This does not remove flexibility. It removes inconsistency. Momentum through participation. There's also a psychological effect at play. When a customer participates, they invest time, thought, attention, and once they invest, they are more likely to continue. Progress creates commitment. Each step forward makes the next step easier. This is especially important in longer sales cycles, where momentum can easily be lost. A well-designed tool keeps the process moving, even when you are not there. Tools must have a purpose. More tools do not improve conversion. Better tools do. Each tool should do one thing: move the decision forward. If it does not create clarity, reinforce understanding, or reduce uncertainty, it is noise. And noise slows everything down. The goal is not to show everything, it is to show what matters. Timing matters. Even the best tool used at the wrong time has little impact. Too early and it feels irrelevant. Too late and it feels unnecessary. Tools should follow understanding. Once the customer sees the problem clearly, tools help them see the solution. They bridge the gap between knowing and believing, from conversation to experience. At this stage, the process shifts again. The customer is no longer just listening. They are experiencing the decision. They are seeing their situation through a product builder, understanding their options with a pricing tool, engaging with a solution through a scoring tool. And when that happens, hesitation reduces, confidence increases, and movement follows. Where this leads. Once the customer is actively engaged, the next challenge is not understanding. It is choosing. They now see the problem. They understand the options. They are moving toward a decision. But without structure, that decision can still feel difficult. Too many possibilities. Too much uncertainty. This is where most conversions slow down. Not because the customer is unsure about the problem, but because the choice itself feels unclear. And that is where we go next. From understanding the situation to guiding the decision. Part 4. Guiding the decision. Once the problem is clear, the customer doesn't need to be sold. They need to be guided. This is where you move from persuasion to clarity, making decisions easier, faster, and more confident. Because the easier the decision feels, the more likely it happens. Chapter 16. Stop selling, start guiding. There's a point in every conversion process where the role of the salesperson must change. Up to now, the focus has been on understanding, asking questions, exploring the situation, identifying the gap, finding the real issue. But once that clarity exists, something important happens. The customer stops looking for answers and starts looking for direction, where most people go wrong. This is the moment where most salespeople revert to habit. They go back to selling. They start presenting more. They push their solution harder. They try to move the customer toward a decision, and in doing so, they introduce friction. Because at this stage, the customer is not looking to be convinced. They are looking to decide. The difference that changes everything. Selling is about persuasion. Guiding is about clarity. When you try to persuade, the customer evaluates you. Is this the right product? Is this person credible? Is this worth it? When you guide, the customer evaluates their decision. Does this make sense? Is this the right direction? Is this what I need? That shift is subtle, but it changes everything because the pressure disappears, the conversation becomes easier, and the customer becomes more open. Why guidance builds trust? Up to this point, trust has been built through understanding. You have listened, you have asked the right questions, you have demonstrated that you understand their situation. Now, trust is built in a different way, through direction, not by telling the customer what to do, but by helping them see what makes sense. When you do that well, the customer feels supported, not sold, and that changes how they respond. The challenge of choice. At this stage, the customer faces a new problem, not understanding the issue, but choosing a solution. And choice is difficult. Too many options create confusion. Too little structure creates hesitation. Left on their own, most people delay. Not because they don't want to move forward, but because they don't want to make the wrong decision. Your role is to simplify. Guiding is about reducing that complexity, not by removing options, but by structuring them, helping the customer see what matters, helping them compare effectively, helping them understand the trade-offs. You are not pushing toward a result. You're making the decision easier. And when the decision is easier, it happens faster. This is not passive. Stopping selling does not mean stepping back. It means stepping in differently. You are still leading the conversation. You are still influencing the outcome. But instead of pushing, you are guiding. There's confidence in that approach. Because you are not trying to convince someone to do something they're unsure about. You're helping them move towards something that fits, handling uncertainty the right way. Every decision carries uncertainty. Will this work? Is this the right choice? What if it doesn't deliver? These questions are always present, whether they are spoken or not. Selling tries to overcome them. Guiding brings them into the open. You acknowledge them. You explore them. You help the customer think them through. This reduces risk. And when risk feels lower, decisions feel safer. Ownership creates commitment. There's another important shift here. Guiding allows the customer to feel in control. They are not being led into a decision. They are arriving at it. They see the options. They understand the implications. They choose the direction. And because it feels like their decision, they are more committed to it. Strong decisions last longer. A decision that feels forced is fragile. A decision that feels owned is stable. This is what guiding creates. It does not just increase conversion. It improves the quality of the decision. And better decisions lead to better outcomes. Where this leads. At this point, the customer understands the problem. They see the gap. They have clarity on what needs to change. Now they are ready to choose. But without structure, that choice can still feel difficult. This is where most conversions slow down. Not because the customer lacks understanding, but because the decision itself feels unclear. This is where the next layer becomes critical. Because once you guide the conversation, you must also structure the decision. That is where we go next. Chapter 17, Decision Architecture. Once the problem is clear and the customer is engaged, the next challenge is not understanding. It is choosing. This is where many conversions slow down, not because the customer is unsure about the problem, but because the decision itself feels difficult. Why decisions stall? Most customers do not struggle with awareness. They struggle with choice. Too many options create confusion. Too little structure creates hesitation. Left on their own, most people delay. Not because they don't want to move forward, but because they don't want to make the wrong decision. And when the risk of making the wrong decision feels high, doing nothing feels safer. The role of decision architecture. This is where decision architecture becomes critical. Decision architecture is not about persuasion. It is about structure. It is the way you present choices so that they are easy to understand, easy to compare, and easy to act on. Whether you are doing this in a presentation or on a website or in a brochure. When done well, it reduces friction. When done poorly, it creates it. The two common mistakes. Most businesses fall into one of two extremes. They present a single option, or they present too many. A single option creates pressure. It forces a yes or no decision too early, and that often leads to hesitation. The customer feels boxed in, and uncertainty increases. Too many options create the opposite problem. The customer struggles to compare. They lose clarity, they become overwhelmed, and when overwhelm appears, delay follows. Clarity sits in the middle. The most effective structure sits between these extremes. A small number of clearly defined options, 2 or 3 seems to work best. Not to manipulate the decision, but to make comparison easier. When the customer can see the differences clearly, they can decide more confidently. And when they can decide more confidently, they move forward. Why structure reduces risk? At this stage, the customer is not just evaluating the solution, they are evaluating the decision. Is this the right choice? Is this the best option? Am I missing something? Without structure, these questions remain unanswered. With structure, they become manageable. The decision is no longer overwhelming. It becomes clear. The power of contrast. Decisions become easier when differences are visible. If options look similar, the decision feels unnecessary. If the differences are unclear, the decision feels risky. Your role is to make the distinctions obvious. What changes between options? What improves? What matters most? When those answers are clear, the decision becomes natural. Price and context. Price is often where hesitation appears, but price is rarely the real issue. Lack of context is. When price is presented in isolation, it creates resistance. When price is presented within a structured comparison, it creates understanding. The customer can see what they are getting. They can see how options differ. They can see how value changes across choices. And when they see that clearly, price becomes part of the decision, not a barrier to it. Simplicity wins. At this stage, complexity is the enemy. The more you explain, the harder the decision becomes. The goal is not to impress the customer with detail. It is to make the decision easy. Clear options, clear differences, clear outcomes. Simplicity creates movement. Timing matters. Decision architecture only works when it is introduced at the right moment. Too early, and it feels disconnected. Too late, and the opportunity slows down. This stage depends on everything that comes before it. If the problem is not clear, the options will not connect. If the gap is not defined, the value will not land. If the customer is not engaged, the structure will not matter. But when the groundwork is done properly, the decision feels like the next logical step. Your role at this stage. You are not persuading. You are not convincing. You are structuring the environment in which the decision is made. You are reducing friction, increasing clarity, and guiding the customer toward a choice that fits. When this is done well, something important happens. The decision does not feel forced. It feels obvious where this leads. At this point, the customer understands the problem. They see the gap. They have clarity on their options. They are moving toward a decision. But even with clarity, one thing still remains: uncertainty. Will this work? Is this the right choice? Can I trust the outcome? These questions sit beneath every decision, and how they are answered determines whether the customer moves forward or hesitates. That is where we go next. Because understanding the structure of decisions is one thing. Understanding how people actually make them is what completes the process. Part 5, the decision. Understanding the decision is not enough. You must execute it consistently. This is where conversations, structure, and process come together in real time. Because without execution, even the best strategy fails. And with it, conversion becomes repeatable. Chapter 18, using conversion tools. Once the decision is structured, the conversation changes. The customer is no longer trying to understand the problem. They are no longer trying to compare options. They are trying to answer one question: will this work for me? And at this stage, what you say matters less than what you show. The limit of explanation. Most people respond to this moment by explaining more. They add detail. They reinforce benefits. They try to strengthen the case with words. But words alone have limits, because the customer is still interpreting, still imagining, still trying to connect what you're saying to their own situation. And that gap between what you say and what they believe is where hesitation lives, from description to demonstration. This is where conversion tools become critical, not as marketing assets like the pricing tools or scoring or building tools, but as decision tools. At this stage, everything you use must do one thing: help the customer see how this works for them. Not in theory, not in general, but in their world. Because when a customer can see it, they no longer have to imagine it. And when they no longer have to imagine it, uncertainty reduces. Why show beats tell? There's a fundamental difference between explanation and evidence. When you explain, the customer listens. When you show, the customer understands. A short example can replace a long explanation. A clear case study can remove doubt faster than reassurance. A simple visual can communicate what words cannot. An experience like a test drive can crush a discussion, because now the decision is no longer based on what you are saying. It is based on what they are seeing and feeling. The role of evidence. At this stage, the customer is asking, has this worked before? Will it work in my situation? Can I trust the outcome? These questions are not answered through promises. They are answered through evidence. A case study is not about telling a story. It is about showing a result. A testimonial is not about praise. It is about proof. The closer the example is to the customer's situation, the stronger the impact. Because relevance builds belief, making it personal. Generic examples create interest. Specific examples create confidence. The more the customer sees themselves in the example, the easier the decision becomes. They're like me. They had the same issue. They got the result I want. That connection shortens the distance between possibility and belief. Organizing the decision. Tools at this stage are not just about proof. They are about clarity, a simple summary, a structured overview, a clear outline of what happens next. These help the customer organize their thinking. Because even when everything makes sense, decisions can still feel overwhelming. Too many details, too many moving parts. When you organize the information, you reduce that complexity. And when complexity reduces, confidence increases. Less is more. One of the most common mistakes at this stage is overloading the customer. Too many documents, too much information, too many examples. The intention is good, but the effect is the opposite. Overload creates hesitation. The goal is not to show everything. It is to show what matters. The right example, the right proof, the right level of detail, nothing more. Timing is everything. Even the best tools lose impact if they are used at the wrong time. Too early and they feel irrelevant. Too late and they feel unnecessary. This stage works because it follows understanding. The problem is clear. The options are structured. Now the tools reinforce belief. They do not replace the conversation. They strengthen it. From thinking to believing. Up to this point, the customer has been thinking. Now they begin to believe. They see how it works. They understand how it applies. They feel more confident in the outcome. And when belief increases, hesitation decreases. Where this leads. At this stage, the decision is close. The customer understands the problem. They see the gap. They have clarity on their options. They believe the solution can work. And yet, they may still hesitate. Not because they don't understand, but because something deeper is still being processed. Risk, confidence, emotion. This is where most decisions are made. Not on logic alone, but on how the decision feels. And that is where we go next, because understanding the structure of a decision is important. But understanding how people actually make it is what completes the process. Chapter 19, The Psychology of Buying. Even when everything makes sense, people still hesitate. They understand the problem. They see the gap. They can follow the logic of the solution. And yet, they pause. This is the moment where many salespeople become confused. From a logical perspective, the decision is clear. But decisions are not made on logic alone. They are made on confidence. Understanding versus confidence. There's a difference between understanding and certainty. A customer can fully understand what you're offering and still feel unsure about choosing it. That uncertainty is what slows conversion, because every decision carries risk. What if it doesn't work? What if it's not the best option? What if I'm missing something? These questions sit beneath the surface, even when they are not spoken. The real role of this stage. At this point, your role is not to explain more. It is to reduce uncertainty. not through pressure, but through clarity. Because when uncertainty decreases, confidence increases. And when confidence reaches a certain level, decisions happen. Logic and emotion work together. Many people believe decisions are logical. In reality, logic supports the decision. Emotion drives it. Logic answers questions like, how does this work? What does it include? What is the cost? Emotion answers a different question. Does this feel right? Both are necessary. Without logic, the decision feels unsafe. Without emotion, the decision lacks urgency. When both are aligned, movement occurs. Where emotion comes from. Emotion is not something you add at the end. It is something you uncover throughout the process. When the gap is clear, emotion becomes real. The frustration of the current situation, the cost of staying where they are, the desire for a better outcome, these are not created. They are revealed. And when they are connected to the solution, the decision gains momentum, reducing perceived risk. Every buying decision involves uncertainty. Even when the logic is strong, there's still a question of what if. Your role is not to eliminate risk. It is to reduce perceived risk. This happens through structure, clarity about what happens next, evidence that it works, confidence in the process. When the unknown becomes smaller, the decision feels safer. The role of reassurance. Reassurance at this stage is not about repeating benefits. It is about reinforcing what's already clear, reminding the customer of what they have seen, confirming what they have understood, connecting the decision back to what matters to them. This builds confidence, not by adding new information, but by strengthening what's already there. The need for enough certainty. Customers are not looking for perfection. They are looking for enough confidence to act. This is an important distinction. If someone waits for complete certainty, they will never decide. There will always be another question, another option, another possibility. Your role is to help them reach a point where the decision feels right, not perfect, but clear enough. Handling hesitation. Hesitation at this stage is normal. It does not mean the deal is lost. It means something is still unclear. The mistake is to push. Pushing increases resistance. The better approach is to stay curious. What's the main thing you're thinking about right now? What would need to be clearer for this to feel right? These questions bring uncertainty into the open, and once it is visible, it can be addressed. Momentum through confirmation. Small confirmations build confidence. Clarifying points, reinforcing agreement, highlighting what's already understood. Each confirmation moves the customer forward, from thinking to deciding, where decisions actually happen. At this stage, the decision is not being made in the conversation. It is being made internally. The customer is weighing. Does this make sense? Does this feel right? Am I ready to move forward? Your role is to support that process, not control it. Where this leads? Once confidence reaches a certain point, something shifts. The decision becomes easier, not because of pressure, but because everything aligns. Understanding, emotion, clarity, confidence. At that point, the final step is simple. The decision becomes visible. This is where most people focus all their attention. The close. But now you understand something different. The close is not where conversion happens. It is where it shows up. And when everything leading up to it is right, it no longer feels like a close. It feels like the next logical step. That's where we go next. Chapter 20, the modern close. For most people, the word close carries weight. It suggests pressure. It suggests persuasion. It suggests a moment where everything depends on what you say next. For years, it has been treated as the defining skill in sales. But by now, you should see it differently. The close is not where conversion happens. It is where the decision becomes visible. Why closing feels difficult? When the earlier stages of the process are weak, the close becomes hard. The salesperson feels the need to push. They try to overcome objections. They attempt to create urgency. The customer feels that pressure and responds with hesitation. The conversation becomes uncomfortable, and the outcome becomes uncertain. This is why so many people focus on closing techniques. They're trying to fix a problem that started much earlier. When the process is right, when the process is strong, the close is simple. The customer understands the problem. They see the gap. They have clarity on their options. They feel confident in the direction. At that point, asking for the decision is not a risk. It is a formality, from decision to confirmation. The modern close is not about asking, "Do you want this?" Because that question forces the customer to reconsider everything. It brings doubt back into the conversation. Instead, the close moves forward. It shifts from decision to confirmation. When would you like to start? What would be the best way to implement this? How would you like this structured? These are not closing techniques. They are natural extensions of a decision that is already forming or formed. Momentum matters. The goal at this stage is to maintain momentum, not restart the decision. When you ask the customer to confirm the next step or choose an option, you keep them moving forward. When you ask them to decide from scratch with anything like a yes or no, you slow them down. That difference is subtle, but it determines whether the process continues or stalls. Confidence is felt. There's another factor that becomes critical here. Confidence. Not confidence in your product. Confidence in the process. When you know that you have taken the customer through a clear, structured journey, when you know the problem is understood and the solution fits, you can move forward without hesitation. That confidence is felt, and it reinforces the customer's own belief that they are making the right decision. Recognizing readiness. Timing matters. Ask too early, and you create resistance. Wait too long, and you allow doubt to return. The key is recognizing when the customer is ready, and readiness shows up in signals. The questions change. The focus shifts. The conversation moves from possibility to detail. They stop asking what if and start asking how. This is the moment. Not every close happens immediately. It is important to understand that not every decision happens in that moment. Some require time. Some require additional input. Some require further steps. The modern close does not force a result that is not ready. It ensures that the next step is clear. If the decision cannot be made now, what happens next? Who needs to be involved? What needs to be confirmed? When will the conversation continue? Clarity at this stage prevents opportunities from drifting. Closing is not a skill. This is the shift. Closing is not a separate skill. It is the result of the system. When the system works, the close takes care of itself. When the system is weak, no technique can compensate. From pressure to progress. When you approach the close this way, everything changes. It no longer feels like a high-pressure moment. It feels like progress. The customer is not being pushed. No, they are moving forward, and that movement is what creates conversion. Where this leads. Even when everything is done well, customers still raise concerns. They hesitate. They question. They want to be sure. These are often called objections, but they are rarely what they seem, because objections are not resistance, they are signals. And understanding those signals is what allows you to move forward without friction. That's where we go next. Chapter 21, Objections Reframed. Objections are often treated as obstacles, something to overcome, something to handle, something to push through. But in reality, objections are not barriers to conversion, they are signals. What an objection really means. When a customer raises an objection, they are not rejecting the idea. They are revealing something that is unclear. It might be uncertainty about the outcome. It might be concern about the price. It might be hesitation about timing. But underneath every objection is the same thing, a lack of confidence, the wrong response. When objections are treated as resistance, the natural response is to push harder, to explain more, to justify the decision, to overcome the concern. But pressure does not create clarity. It increases resistance. And when resistance increases, the conversation tightens. The right response. When objections are treated as signals, the response changes. You slow down, you ask, you clarify, you agree with the objection, you repeat it back to them, and you start to move the conversation forward. Because your role is not to win an argument, it is to remove uncertainty. Most objections are built earlier. Objections rarely appear suddenly. They build over time. They come from moments earlier in the process where something was missed. A question not fully explored, a concern not addressed, a detail not clarified. If you keep getting the same objections, it shows you there's a step missing or a problem in your conversion engine. By the time the objection is voiced, it has already been forming. This is why the best way to handle objections, is to prevent them. Prevention through clarity. When diagnosis is strong, objections reduce. When the gap is clear, hesitation decreases. When the decision is structured properly, confusion disappears. This does not eliminate objections completely, but it changes their nature. Instead of broad resistance, you deal with specific concerns. And specific concerns are easier to resolve. The truth about price objections: it's too expensive is one of the most common objections, but it is rarely about price. It is about value. If the customer clearly sees the gap, if they understand the outcome, if they believe the solution will work, price becomes part of the decision, not a reason to avoid it. If they don't see those things clearly, price becomes the easiest way to express uncertainty. The objection is not too expensive. It's I'm not convinced. Going back to understanding, this is why responding with justification rarely works. Explaining more features or breaking down the price does not address the real issue. The better approach is to return to clarity. What part of this feels unclear? What are you comparing this to? What would need to be different for this to feel right? These questions do not challenge the customer. They help them think. And when they think, they often reveal the real concern. Objections are engagement. There's another important shift here. An objection is not a negative sign. It is a sign of engagement. A customer who raises a concern is still in the process. They are still thinking. They are still considering. They are still moving forward. Silence is far more dangerous than objection. Silence often means disengagement. The conversation has lost momentum. The opportunity is fading. An objection, on the other hand, is an opportunity. Tone matters. How you respond matters just as much as what you say. If you become defensive, trust drops. If you become dismissive, the relationship weakens. If you push too hard, resistance increases. The goal is to stay calm, curious, and focused. You are not trying to win. You are trying to understand. Patterns reveal the system. If the same objections appear repeatedly, it is not coincidence. It is a pattern, and patterns indicate a gap in the system. Something is missing earlier in the process. Something is unclear in how the solution is presented. Something needs to be addressed before the decision stage. When you identify that pattern, you can fix it. And when you fix it, future conversations improve. From objection to clarity. When handled properly, objections lose their weight. They're no longer something to fear. They become part of the process, a way to refine, a way to clarify, a way to strengthen the decision. Where this leads. Even when objections are resolved, decisions do not always happen immediately. Sometimes the customer pauses. They need time. They need space. They need to think. This is where many opportunities are lost, not because the answer is no, but because the process stops moving. Understanding how to manage that moment is what determines whether the decision continues or disappears. That's where we go next. Chapter 22, Speed versus Delay. Even when everything lines up, decisions don't always happen immediately. The problem is clear, the gap is defined, the options make sense, the objections have been addressed, and still, the customer pauses. They say they need time, they want to think, they need to check something. They'll come back later. This is where many opportunities are lost, not because the answer is no, but because the process stops moving. Delay is not the problem. Delay itself is not negative. It is part of the process. People need time to think, to reflect, to involve others, and to consider implications. The mistake is assuming that delay means disinterest. Often it means the opposite. It means the decision matters. The real issue is drift. The real problem is not delay. It is lack of direction. When a conversation ends without a clear next step, momentum fades. The customer gets busy. Other priorities take over. The emotional connection weakens. And what was once an active decision becomes a forgotten one. Two types of delay. To manage this properly, you need to distinguish between two types of delay: structured delay and unstructured delay. Structured delay has clarity. There's a reason, there's a next step, there's a timeline. Something needs to happen and it is understood. Unstructured delay is vague. I'll think about it. We'll come back to you. Let me review this. There is no defined action, no clear path forward. This is where opportunities disappear. Turning delay into movement. Your role is not to eliminate delay. It is to turn delay into movement. That starts by making the next step visible. If the decision cannot be made now, what needs to happen next? Who needs to be involved? What needs to be confirmed? When will that be done? Clarity replaces vagueness, and vagueness is what causes drift. Hold direction without pressure. There's a balance at this stage. Push too hard and you create resistance. Step back too far and you lose momentum. The goal is to hold direction. You keep the process moving forward without forcing the outcome. This is where language matters. Instead of pushing for a decision, you create clarity around it. What needs to be resolved before this moves forward? What's the main thing you're considering right now? What would make this feel like the right decision? These questions do not create pressure. They create progress. Define the next step before you leave. Momentum should never depend on follow-up alone. It should be built into the conversation. Before the interaction ends, the next step must be clear. Not, I'll follow up next week, but let's reconnect Thursday at 10 once you've reviewed this. Does that work? Specific beats vague. Scheduled beats assumed. When the next step is defined, the process continues. Conditional decisions create clarity. There's a simple way to bring direction to delay. Convert uncertainty into a condition. If we can solve this part, are you comfortable moving forward? This does not force a yes. It reveals what matters. If the answer is yes, you know exactly what to address. If the answer is no, you know the issue runs deeper. Either way, you gain clarity. Time increases doubt. There's another factor to consider. Delay creates space, and space allows doubt to grow. New information appears. Other options emerge. Confidence fades. This is why maintaining relevance during delay matters. Not through constant contact, but through purposeful connection. A short message, a relevant insight, a reminder of what matters. Each interaction keeps the decision alive. Patterns reveal weakness. If opportunities consistently stall at a certain stage, it is not random. It is a signal. Something earlier in the process is not strong enough. The gap may not be clear. The decision structure may be weak. Confidence may not be high enough. Delay is feedback, and feedback tells you where to improve. Managing momentum. Conversion is not about forcing decisions. It is about maintaining movement. When momentum is strong, decisions happen naturally. When momentum is weak, even strong opportunities fade. Your role is not to control the outcome. It is to manage the process. And that means keeping it moving, where this leads. At this point, you understand how individual decisions happen, how conversations move, how momentum is created, how delays are managed. Now we move to something bigger. Because conversion is not just about individual interactions. It is about systems. Repeatable, scalable systems that produce consistent results. And that begins by mapping the process itself. Because if you cannot see the system, you cannot improve it. That's where we go next. Part 6, the conversion system. Individual performance creates results. Systems create scale. This is where you move from relying on people to building a process that works every time. Because what you can map, you can improve. And what you can improve, you can grow. Chapter 23, Mapping the Conversion Process. At this point, you understand how people buy. You understand how they think, how they move, how they hesitate, and what drives them forward. Now we move from understanding to systems, because if you cannot see your conversion process clearly, you cannot improve it. The invisible system, most businesses already have a conversion process. They just cannot see it. Conversations happen in a certain order. Interactions follow familiar patterns. Steps are taken, sometimes consistently, sometimes not. But the process is not defined. It lives in people's heads. And when a process is invisible, it cannot be managed. Why this matters. When conversion is not mapped, results feel unpredictable. Some conversations go well, others don't. Some opportunities move forward, others stall, and no one can explain why. The issue is not effort. The issue is visibility, making the process visible. Mapping your conversion process means turning something informal into something structured. It allows you to see how a prospect moves from first interaction to decision and beyond. Not in theory, but in reality, what actually happens. The mistake of oversimplification. Most people try to simplify the process too much. They reduce it to a few broad stages: contact, meeting, proposal, close. It feels clean, but it hides what is really happening because each of those stages contains multiple smaller steps. A conversation is not a single moment. It is a sequence. A proposal is not a step. It is part of a progression with many steps, documents, templates, and maybe even scripts. Even follow-up is not one action. It is a series of interactions over time. When the process is mapped too broadly, you lose the ability to improve it. Detail creates control. The real power comes from going deeper, breaking each stage down into what actually happens. When a prospect engages, what is the first response? What is said? What happens next? What do we send them? When you move into diagnosis, what questions are always asked? What information is gathered? How is it structured? When you guide the decision, how are options presented? What tools are used? What sequence is followed? The more detailed the map, the more useful it becomes. Not because it creates complexity, but because it creates clarity, seeing where it breaks. Once the process is visible, patterns emerge. You begin to see where movement slows, where conversations lose direction, where momentum drops, where opportunities disappear. These are not random. They are points where the system is breaking, and once you can see them, you can fix them, from outcome to stage. Instead of asking, why didn't that deal get done? You ask, at what stage did it stop moving? That question changes everything, because it leads to action. If prospects disengage early, the engagement stage needs work. If they stall after diagnosis, the understanding is not deep enough. If they hesitate at decision, structure is not clear. Each stage becomes measurable, and each stage becomes improvable. Removing dependence on individuals. There is another benefit that matters even more: scale. When the process lives in someone's head, it cannot be replicated. It depends on individual skill, experience, and instinct. Some perform well, others don't, and consistency becomes impossible. When the process is mapped, it can be taught, it can be followed, it can be improved across the team. This is how performance becomes scalable. Structure without rigidity. A system does not remove flexibility. It creates consistency. The steps are clear, but how they are executed can adapt. Different customers, different situations, different styles. The structure remains, the delivery adjusts. This is what makes a system effective. From activity to design, at this point, something shifts. You are no longer reacting to conversations. You are designing them. You are no longer hoping interactions go well. You are building a process that leads them there. This is the difference between activity and architecture. Where this leads, once your process is mapped, the next challenge becomes clear: execution. Because knowing the steps is not enough. You need to know how to deliver them consistently. What to say, how to say it, when to say it. This is where most businesses struggle. Because without structure, conversations drift. With structure, they flow. And that structure comes from something many people misunderstand: scripts, but not in the way most people think. That's where we go next. Chapter 24 is scripts that actually work. The word script makes a lot of people uncomfortable. It suggests something rigid, something forced, something that turns a conversation into a performance. For many, it brings to mind a salesperson reading lines that feel unnatural and disconnected. That is not what we are building here. The real purpose of a script. A good script does not remove authenticity. It protects it. Without structure, most conversations drift. Important questions get missed. Key moments are skipped. The direction changes depending on confidence, experience, or mood. Some conversations go well, others don't, and no one can clearly explain why. Structure creates consistency. This is the real purpose of scripting. Not to control what you say word for word, but to ensure that the conversation consistently moves in the right direction. Think of a script as a framework. It defines the key moments that must happen, the questions that must be asked, the transitions that must be made, the sequence that must be followed. Within that framework, you are still yourself. Your tone remains. Your personality remains. Your style remains. But the structure ensures that nothing important is left to chance. The two extremes. Most people fall into one of two traps. They reject scripts completely and rely on instinct. or they follow scripts too rigidly and lose connection. Neither works. Instinct creates inconsistency. Rigidity creates disconnection. The right approach sits in the middle. Structure with flexibility. Why this matters. Every stage of the conversion engine benefits from structure. At the engagement stage, you need a consistent way to respond that creates movement. At the diagnosis stage, you need questions that uncover the real situation. At the guidance stage, you need a clear way to present options. At the conversion stage, you need language that moves the decision forward naturally. And these are not things you want to improvise. They are things you want to refine. Confidence through repetition. A well-built script evolves over time. You test it, you use it, you adjust it, you improve it. Over time, it becomes sharper, clearer, more effective. This is where repetition creates confidence. When you know what comes next, you relax. When you relax, you listen better. When you listen better, you respond more effectively. Confidence is not just belief, it is preparation. Timing is built into your structure. What you say matters, but when you say it, matters just as much. A question asked too early feels intrusive. A solution presented too soon feels irrelevant. An attempted close too quickly creates resistance. Scripts help manage that timing. They ensure that each stage unfolds in the right sequence. Understanding before solution, clarity before decision, confidence before commitment. This is what creates flow. Learning from patterns. One of the biggest advantages of scripting is feedback. When the same objection appears repeatedly, you adjust the script. When conversations stall at the same point, you refine the transition. When clarity breaks down, you strengthen the language. Over time, the script becomes a reflection of what actually works. Not theory, not guesswork, but proven structure. Scaling across a team. This is where scripting becomes essential. Without structure, performance varies. Each person develops their own approach. Some succeed, others struggle. With structure, the foundation is shared. The best questions are used consistently. The strongest transitions become standard. The process becomes repeatable. This does not create uniformity. It creates alignment. The script serves the conversation. There's one principle that must always remain. The script is there to support the conversation, not replace it. If you focus too much on following the script, you stop listening. You miss cues. You ignore signals. You lose connection. The script guides you. The customer leads you. When those two work together, the conversation becomes both structured and responsive. From guessing to intention. At this point, something shifts. You are no longer relying on instinct. You are operating with intention. You know what needs to happen. You know when it needs to happen. You know how to guide it. And that is what creates consistent results, where this leads. Once your conversations are structured, the next step becomes clear. You need to support them, not just with what you say, but with what you use. Because at every stage of the process, there is an opportunity to reinforce clarity, to strengthen understanding, to keep the process moving. And that is where tools come in, not as extras, but as part of the system. That's where we go next. Chapter 25, Tools at Every Step. Once your process is mapped and your conversations are structured, there is one more layer to build. Support, not in the form of more explanation, but in the form of tools that reinforce what is being said at exactly the right moment. Why tools matter. Most businesses already have tools, brochures, presentations, proposals, emails, documents, but they are used inconsistently, sometimes too early, sometimes too late, sometimes without a clear purpose. So while they exist, they do not meaningfully improve conversion, from assets to system. In a structured process, tools are not optional. They are integrated. Each stage of the conversion engine has a specific need, and the tools used at that stage must support that need. Not randomly, not occasionally, but consistently. Alignment creates flow. When tools are aligned with the process, something important happens. The experience becomes smoother. The customer is no longer relying on memory alone. They are not trying to piece together information from conversations. They have reference points. They can revisit what was discussed. They can reflect on it. They can share it with others. And when they can do that, decisions become easier. Supporting each stage. At the engagement stage, tools should create clarity quickly. A simple explanation, a short piece of information, something that helps the customer understand what happens next. At the diagnosis stage, tools should support discovery. something that captures information, something that structures thinking, something that ensures nothing important is missed. At the guidance stage, tools should simplify decisions, something that helps compare options, something that makes differences visible, something that reduces complexity. At the conversion stage, tools should reinforce confidence, clear summaries, simple agreements, structured proposals, nothing confusing, nothing ambiguous, just clarity. And at the follow-up stage, tools should maintain connection, something that keeps the conversation alive, something that reinforces relevance, something that ensures the process does not fade, extending the conversation. Tools do something that conversation alone cannot. They continue the process when you are not there. The customer reviews, reflects, shares. The conversation moves forward, even in your absence. This is especially important when decisions involve multiple people, because the conversation rarely stays with one individual. Tools ensure that what was discussed is not lost. They reduce distortion. They maintain alignment. Consistency builds trust. Without tools, every interaction is slightly different. Different explanations, different depth, different clarity. With tools, the foundation stays the same. Every customer receives a consistent experience. Every conversation is supported in the same way. This does not remove flexibility. It removes inconsistency. And consistency builds trust. Less but better. More tools do not improve conversion. Better tools do. Too many documents create overwhelm. Too much information slows decisions. The goal is not volume, it is precision. Each tool should serve a clear purpose: to clarify, to reinforce, to move forward. If it does not do one of those things, it is noise, a system that improves over time. When tools are used consistently, something powerful happens. You can improve them, you can see what works, you can refine what doesn't, you can test and adjust. Over time, clarity increases, and the process becomes stronger, and conversion improves, from support to scale. At this point, the conversion engine is no longer theoretical. It is operational. Conversations are structured. Tools are aligned. The process is consistent. And that consistency creates something else: visibility. Because once the system is being executed properly, you can measure it. You can see where it works. You can see where it breaks. And once you can see that, you can improve it. Where this leads, at some point, every system must be measured. Without measurement, improvement is guesswork. You might feel things are working. You might sense that something is off, but you cannot say exactly where. This is where most businesses plateau. Not because they lack effort, but because they lack clarity. And that is what the next chapter provides. Because once you can measure conversion, you can manage it. And once you can manage it, you can scale it. Chapter 26, Conversion Metrics. At some point, every system must be measured. Without measurement, improvement is guesswork. You might feel like things are working. You might sense that something is off, but you cannot say with certainty where the issue lies or how to fix it. Conversion is no different. From activity to visibility, up to now, you have built a process. You understand how prospects enter, how they engage, how they are understood, how decisions are guided, and how relationships are extended. But unless you can see how that process is performing, you are relying on instinct. And instinct does not scale. What most businesses measure. Most businesses measure outcomes. How many leads they generate, how many sales they close, what revenue they produce. These numbers are important, but they do not tell you what's happening in between. And that is where the real insight sits, where the real data lives. Conversion is not a single number. It is a series of stage-based movements, from entry to engagement, from engagement to conversation, from conversation to decision. Each stage has a conversion rate, and each rate tells a story, seeing the system clearly. When you measure conversion properly, you stop asking, how many deals did we close? And start asking, how many prospects engaged? How many moved into meaningful conversations? How many reached a decision point? Where did they slow down? Where did they drop off? And these are not abstract questions. They are operational. And when you can answer them, patterns appear. Patterns reveal problems. You may find that many prospects engage, but few move forward. That suggests a problem in how conversations are structured. You may find that conversations are strong, but decisions stall. That suggests a problem in how choices are presented or confidence is built. You may find that customers convert once, but rarely return. That points to a weakness in follow-up or relationship management. Each pattern points to a specific stage, and each stage can be improved. The few metrics that matter. There are many numbers you can track, but only a few truly drive the system. Conversion rate, how effectively you turn opportunities into customers. Time to decision, how long it takes for a prospect to move from entry to commitment. Stage progression, how smoothly prospects move from one stage to the next. Channel performance, how different entry points convert and behave. These metrics do not just describe results, they explain them, from guessing to managing. Without measurement, you react. You see outcomes after they happen. You try to fix problems without knowing where they started. With measurement, you manage. You see where the system is breaking. You know where to focus. You improve specific parts of the process. And when those parts improve, the outcome improves. Predictability changes everything. When conversion is measured properly, growth becomes predictable. You can estimate how many opportunities you need. You can see where improvements will have the greatest impact. You can allocate time, energy, and resources more effectively. Instead of hoping for results, you build them. Consistency creates insight. Metrics only work if they are tracked consistently, not occasionally. Not only when something goes wrong, but continuously, because trends matter. Small declines become visible early. Small improvements can be reinforced. And over time, the system becomes stronger. Numbers support judgment. This is not about reducing conversion to a spreadsheet. It is about supporting judgment with clarity, understanding what is happening, seeing where attention is needed, making decisions based on evidence, not assumption. The system becomes controllable. When you combine a clear process, consistent execution, and measurable stages, you move into a different position. You are no longer reacting to results. You are managing the system that creates them. And that is where real control begins, where this leads. Even with strong conversion, the real value is not in a single decision. It is in what happens next. Because most businesses focus on getting the customer. Very few focus on what happens after. And that is where the real opportunity sits. Because the first sale is not where value is created. It is where value begins. And what happens after that determines everything. That's where we go next. Because the fortune is not in the first conversation, it is in what follows. Part 7, follow-up, where sales really happen. Most opportunities aren't lost in the conversation. They're lost in what happens after. This is where momentum is maintained, trust is reinforced, and decisions are completed. Because the fortune is rarely in the first interaction, it's in what follows. Chapter 27, the fortune is in the follow-up. There's a moment after every conversation where most businesses lose. Not because the customer said no, but because nothing happened next. Where opportunities actually disappear. Conversation ends. The customer says they will think about it. They need to check something. They will come back later. The salesperson makes a note, maybe sets a reminder, then moves on. Days pass, sometimes weeks. Eventually the follow-up happens. If it happens at all. By then the momentum is gone. The decision has faded. The urgency has disappeared. The opportunity is lost. Not because the customer chose something else, but because the process stopped. Follow-up is not optional. Most sales do not happen in the first conversation. They happen in what follows. The customer needs time to process, time to reflect, time to compare. Follow-up is what keeps you inside that process. Without it, you disappear. And when you disappear, something else takes your place. Another priority, another supplier, another conversation. The real role of follow-up. Follow-up is not an administrative task. It is part of conversion. It is where decisions are reinforced, where clarity is maintained, where momentum is preserved. When done well, it does not restart the conversation. It continues it. Why most follow-up fails? Most follow-up sounds the same. Just checking in. Have you had a chance to think about it? Let me know if you have any questions. These messages do not move the process forward. They simply reopen it. And reopening is not enough. Follow-up that moves the decision. Strong follow-up has purpose. It references what was discussed. It adds something relevant. It gives the customer a reason to respond. Instead of asking if they have questions, you give them something to think about. What stood out most from our last conversation? When you reviewed this, what felt most relevant to your situation? These are not check-ins. They are extensions. They move the conversation forward. Timing preserves momentum. Timing matters. Too soon and it feels unnecessary. Too late and it loses relevance. The best follow-up happens while the conversation is still active in the customer's mind. This is why it should be planned before the conversation ends, not as an afterthought, but as part of the process. When we speak next, once you've reviewed this, let's reconnect on clear next steps create continuity. Consistency builds trust. One follow-up is rarely enough. People are busy. They forget. They delay. They get distracted. Consistent, thoughtful follow-up keeps you present. Not in a way that feels intrusive, but in a way that feels reliable. And reliability builds trust. Follow-up is a preview. How you follow up sends a message. It shows what it will be like to work with you. If communication is inconsistent, the customer questions the relationship. If it is clear and reliable, confidence increases. Follow-up is not just about the current decision. It is a preview of what comes next. The compounding effect. There's another layer most businesses miss. Follow-up does not just close deals. It increases the value of every deal. A customer who feels supported is more likely to stay, buy again, refer others. A customer who feels forgotten does the opposite. After the sale matters more. Most businesses stop at the sale. They move on to the next opportunity. But this is where the real value is created. The period immediately after the decision determines whether the relationship strengthens or weakens. A strong follow-up after the sale reinforces the decision. It reduces doubt. It builds confidence. It confirms that the customer made the right choice. Follow-up connects everything. This is why follow-up sits at the center of the conversion engine. It connects the decision to the relationship. It ensures that momentum does not stop at the point of sale. It carries it forward. From transaction to value. When follow-up is done consistently, something changes. You stop creating one-time transactions and start building ongoing value. Because the real opportunity is not the first sale. It is what happens after it. Where this leads, follow-up keeps a conversation alive, but it is not enough on its own. Because not every opportunity is ready now. Some take time, weeks, months, sometimes longer. Without a system, those opportunities disappear. Not because they were not viable, but because you were not there when they were ready. This is where the next level begins. Because follow-up maintains momentum, but nurture creates presence. And presence is what ensures you are there when the decision finally happens. That's where we go next. Chapter 28, Nurture Systems. Follow-up keeps a conversation alive. Nurture keeps the relationship alive. There is a difference. The gap most businesses ignore. Follow-up happens immediately after a conversation. It maintains momentum while a decision is being made. But not every decision happens quickly. Some customers take time, weeks, months, sometimes longer. And this is where most businesses lose. Not because the opportunity was wrong, but because they disappeared. The problem with reactive communication. Most businesses communicate reactively. They follow up when there is an opportunity. They respond when the customer reaches out. They engage when there is something to sell. And in between those moments, there's silence. That silence is where relationships fade. Nurture removes the silence. A nurture system fills that gap. It ensures that you remain present. Not just when a decision is active, but throughout the entire life cycle of the relationship. Because timing matters. A prospect who is not ready today may be ready in 3 months. A customer who bought once may be ready again later. A contact who showed interest may need time before acting. Without nurture, these opportunities drift away. With it, they stay connected. Presence without pressure. Nurture is not about pushing a sale. It is about staying relevant. Consistently, not in a way that feels forced, but in a way that feels useful. This might be through insights, perspectives, ideas that help the customer think differently. The goal is not to sell. The goal is to remain valuable. And when you remain valuable, you remain visible. Relevance creates consideration. Customers do not act on every message they receive. They filter. They ignore what feels generic. They engage with what feels relevant. This is why nurture must be aligned with the customer, what they care about, what they are facing, what they are trying to achieve. When communication reflects that, it gets attention. And attention creates opportunity. Consistency builds trust. Trust is not built in a single interaction. It is built over time through repeated relevant experiences. When you show up consistently without always asking for something, you create a different kind of relationship. You are not just present when you need something. You are present because you are committed to the outcome. That distinction matters. From opportunity to relationship, nurture shifts the focus from individual opportunities to ongoing relationships. Because when the relationship is strong, decisions become easier. The customer already knows you. They already trust you. They already see your value. When the time's right, they move. Discipline creates results. Nurture is not random. It is structured. If communication is inconsistent, the relationship weakens. If it is too frequent or irrelevant, it becomes noise. The balance is consistency with value. Each interaction should have a purpose. Not necessarily to sell, but to contribute, the compounding effect. Nurture creates a cumulative advantage. Each interaction may seem small, a message, an idea, a reminder, but over time they build. They reinforce your position, they deepen familiarity, and they strengthen trust. And when the moment of decision arrives, you are already part of the conversation. From forgotten to default. Without nurture, you are forgotten. With nurture, you become a default option. Not because you pushed your way in, but because you never left. Where this leads, nurture ensures you remain present. But presence alone is not enough. Because being present does not guarantee you will be chosen. You must also be remembered at the right moment. When the need becomes urgent, when the decision becomes real, when the customer is ready to act, that is a different challenge. Because it is not about communication. It is about position. Being the one they think of first. That's where we go next. Chapter 29, Staying Top of Mind. In most markets, the problem is not awareness. It is memory. Customers may know you exist. They may have spoken to you before. They may have even been close to making a decision. And yet, when the moment comes to act, they choose someone or something else. Not because that option is better, but because it is present, the reality of modern buying. People move on. They get busy. They get distracted. They shift priorities. And unless you remain visible in a meaningful way, you're forgotten. This is not personal. It is how attention works. Visibility versus relevance. Many businesses try to solve this with volume. More emails, more posts, more messages. But visibility without relevance becomes noise. Customers do not remember everything they see. They remember what matters. The goal is not more exposure. The goal is not to be seen more often. It is to be remembered at the right time. That requires two things, consistency and relevance. Consistency ensures you are not forgotten. Relevance ensures you are not ignored. When both are present, something powerful happens. You remain in the customer's awareness without creating resistance. From presence to position, this is where staying top of mind becomes different from nurture. Nurture maintains the relationship. Top of mind defines your position within it. It ensures that when a need arises, you are one of the first options considered. Not because you pushed, but because you are already there. The power of repetition. This does not happen through a single interaction. It happens through repetition, not repetition of the same message, but repetition of relevance. Each time the customer sees something that connects with their situation, your position strengthens. You become familiar. You become credible. You become a default. Timing is everything. Being top of mind does not mean being constantly visible. It means being visible when it matters. When the problem becomes urgent, when the decision becomes real, when the customer is ready to act. This requires understanding your customer's rhythm. When they think, when they review, when they decide, and aligning your presence with those moments. The cumulative effect. Each interaction on its own is small. A message, a piece of content, a reminder. But over time, they compound. They reinforce your position. They deepen familiarity. They strengthen trust. And when the moment of decision arrives, The customer does not start from zero. They start with you already in mind. Why this changes conversion? When you are top of mind, decisions happen faster. The customer does not need to rediscover you. They do not need to reevaluate from scratch. They move forward. This shortens the sales cycle and increases conversion. Consistency beats intensity. One strong interaction is not enough. A series of consistent, relevant interactions creates lasting impact. This is where most businesses get it wrong. They focus on intensity, big campaigns, heavy outreach, short bursts of activity. But consistency is what builds position. It's not about you. There is one final point that matters. Staying top of mind is not about you. It is about the customer, what they need, what they care about, what's happening in their world. When your communication reflects that, it feels natural. When it doesn't, it feels self-serving. And that determines whether you are remembered or ignored, where this leads. Once you are top of mind, something changes. The relationship strengthens. The customer stays connected. They return. They engage again. And when that happens, the opportunity expands. Because now the focus is no longer just on a single decision. It is on long-term value. Not just acquiring customers, but building clients. And that is where the real growth begins. Part 8, lifetime value and expansion. The first sale is not the goal. It's the starting point. This is where you move from transactions to relationships and from customers to long-term value. Because real growth comes from what happens after the sale. Chapter 30, from customer to member. Most businesses measure success at the point of sale. A deal is closed, a payment is made, a target is hit, and then the focus shifts to the next opportunity. The limitation of this thinking. This is one of the biggest constraints in business growth. Because the first sale is not the outcome, it is the beginning. A customer is someone who has bought once. A client is someone who stays. That difference determines everything. The cost of starting over. A business built on one-time customers must constantly replace them. New leads, new conversations, new sales. Every month the cycle starts again. This creates pressure and limits growth. A business built on clients works differently. It grows through the relationships it already has. It compounds value. The moment that defines the relationship, the transition from customer to client does not happen automatically. It is created, and it begins immediately after the first decision. In that moment, the customer is asking a new set of questions. Did I make the right choice? Will this deliver what I expect? What happens next? How you respond to that moment determines everything. Where most businesses lose momentum. After the sale, attention shifts. The deal is done. The focus moves on, and the relationship is left to develop on its own. This is where value is lost. Because without direction, confidence fades. And when confidence fades, engagement drops. The experience after the sale. The period immediately after the sale is critical. It either reinforces the decision or weakens it. If the customer feels supported, they gain confidence. If they feel uncertain, doubt begins. This is why delivery is not just about the product or service. It is about the experience. Clarity builds confidence. The customer needs to know what happens next, what to expect, what to do, how the process works. Without clarity, even a strong solution feels uncertain. With clarity, the relationship strengthens. Consistency builds trust. The experience after the sale must match what came before it. If the communication changes, if the quality drops, if the engagement fades, trust weakens. If it remains consistent, trust grows. And trust is what turns customers into clients. Retention is conversion continued. Retention is not a separate function. It is an extension of conversion. Every interaction after the sale either reinforces the decision or undermines it. This is why the process does not stop at the close. It continues from transaction to relationship. The more consistent and valuable the experience becomes, the more the relationship shifts from a transaction to an ongoing connection. And once that connection exists, something changes. The customer is no longer evaluating you each time. They are expecting to work with you. Growth without starting over. This is where real leverage begins. A client who trusts you is far more likely to return, expand, refer others. This removes the need to constantly start from zero. Growth becomes more stable, more predictable. Value compounds over time. A one-time customer has limited value. A repeat customer has more. A long-term client multiplies it. Each interaction builds on the last. Each decision becomes easier. Each opportunity becomes larger. This is how businesses scale, not through constant acquisition, but through compounding relationships. The shift that changes everything. When you move from focusing on customers to building clients, everything changes. You stop chasing. You start building. Where this leads. Once a customer becomes a client, the relationship deepens. But it does not stop there. Because not all clients create the same value. Some stay, some grow, some bring others with them. This is where the next level begins. Because once you understand how to build relationships, you need to understand how to grow them. And that is where we go next, the ladder of loyalty. Chapter 31, the ladder of loyalty. Most businesses believe growth comes from getting more customers. It doesn't. Growth comes from increasing the value of the customers you already have. The hidden problem. Most businesses spend the majority of their time, money, and energy chasing new prospects. More marketing, more outreach, more activity. Meanwhile, the customers they already have remain static. Or worse, they leave. The economics of loyalty. The reality is simple. It is significantly more expensive to acquire a new customer than to retain an existing one. And yet most businesses behave as if the opposite is true. They hunt constantly. Very few farm. The ladder that drives growth. The ladder of loyalty is the shift from hunting to farming. It is the system that turns a single transaction into long-term value. It shows how a relationship evolves, from initial awareness to active advocacy. And more importantly, it shows where profit is created. Not all customers are equal. Every customer sits somewhere on the ladder, and where they sit determines their value. At the base are those who do not know you. They are potential, but not opportunity. We refer to them as the suspects. Then comes those who become aware. They engage. They show interest. They enter your world. They are the prospects. This is where most businesses begin. But this is not where value is created. The first transaction, the first purchase is a test. The customer is not loyal. They are the shopper. They are evaluating. They are asking, was this worth it? Does this deliver? Should I continue? What happens at this stage determines everything. A weak experience ends the relationship after just a single transaction. A strong experience moves it forward, from the shopper to the customer. When the customer buys again, something changes. There's familiarity. There's growing trust. Patterns begin to form. But this is still not where real value exists. The shift happens when they move beyond buying and into belonging. The power of belonging. The member. A member does not just purchase. They engage. They expect to work with you. They no longer compare you to alternatives every time. This is where the relationship stabilizes and where profitability begins to compound. From member to advocate. As the relationship strengthens, something else begins to happen. The customer starts to recommend you, not occasionally, but intentionally. They introduce others. They speak positively. They support your position. At this point, they're no longer just a customer or a member. They are part of your growth. The highest level, raving fan. At the top of the ladder are those who go further. They promote you consistently. They bring opportunities to you. They amplify your message. They become an extension of your marketing and sales system. This is where exponential growth happens. Your raving fans build your business for you. Movement is not automatic. The ladder does not build itself. Customers do not move upward naturally. They stay where they are left. This is where most businesses fail, and they treat all customers the same. They deliver the same experience, regardless of stage. And as a result, relationships stall, designing the movement. Each level requires a different approach. Someone new needs awareness. Someone interested needs trust. A first-time buyer needs a strong experience. A repeat customer needs consistency. A member needs recognition. An advocate needs a reason to refer. If you treat them all the same, they stop moving. If you guide them, they progress to raving fans and talk about you to their friends, family connections, and through their social media. The compounding effect. This is where the power of the ladder becomes clear. A one-time customer has limited value. A repeat customer has more. A committed client multiplies it. An advocate expands it. and a raving fan accelerates it. Each step builds on the last. Each level increases both revenue and opportunity, the discipline most avoid. Not every customer should move up the ladder. Some customers create friction. They take more than they contribute. They drain time, energy, and focus. Holding on to them limits growth. The strongest businesses are selective. They focus on the customers who move and let go of those who don't, where this connects. The conversion engine brings customers in. The ladder of loyalty grows their value. Together they create a system where you do not start from zero each time, a system where growth compounds, a system where your best customers become your greatest asset. Where this leads. Once customers begin to move up the ladder, something else becomes possible. Predictability. Because when relationships are stable and value is growing, revenue becomes more consistent. This is where the next level begins. Because loyalty alone is powerful. But when it is structured properly, it becomes recurring, and recurring revenue changes everything. Chapter 32, Membership and Recurring Revenue. If the ladder of loyalty shows you how value grows over time, membership shows you how to lock that value in. The limitation of one-time revenue. Most businesses operate on transactions. A customer buys. The interaction ends. The business goes back to finding the next customer. And the cycle repeats. There's nothing wrong with this model, but it has a ceiling. Because every month, you start from zero. The pressure of starting over. When revenue is built on one-time transactions, growth depends on constant activity. New leads, new conversations, new sales. Just to maintain the same level. This creates pressure and limits scalability. The shift to recurring revenue. Recurring revenue changes that dynamic. Instead of starting from zero, you start from a base. A group of customers who are already engaged, already committed, already part of your business. This creates stability. Revenue becomes predictable. Planning becomes easier and pressure reduces. It's not about billing. Many businesses misunderstand this shift. They focus on pricing, subscriptions, monthly fees, payment structures. But recurring revenue is not primarily a pricing model. It is a relationship model. Membership creates belonging. A true membership is not just a way to charge regularly. It is a way to create belonging. The customer is no longer making a one-time decision. They are joining something, and that changes behavior. They stop asking, should I buy again? And start assuming they will continue. Reducing friction in future decisions. This shift is powerful. It removes friction from future purchases. It reduces comparison with competitors. It increases engagement over time. Because the relationship is no longer transactional, it is ongoing. Why recurring models win? Recurring revenue models outperform transactional ones for a simple reason. They do not rely on repeated persuasion. They rely on ongoing value. When the value is clear and consistent, retention increases. And retention is where profitability compounds. The power of retention. A customer who stays for 1 month has limited value. A customer who stays for 12 months multiplies it. A customer who stays for years transforms it. This is where the economics change. You are no longer chasing new revenue. You are building on existing revenue, delivering ongoing value. And this is where many businesses fail. They build the model, but not the experience. Without ongoing value, membership becomes a cost. And when it feels like a cost, customers leave. A strong membership creates reasons to stay. Access, convenience, progression, something that continues to matter. Engagement drives retention. The more the customer engages, the more likely they are to stay. They participate, they interact, they see progress, and that reinforces the decision. This is where recurring revenue becomes sustainable. From customer to member. Membership sits at a critical point in the ladder of loyalty. It moves someone from buying to belonging. And once that shift happens, something important changes. The relationship stabilizes. The strategic advantage. Recurring revenue is not just about predictability. It is about leverage. It allows you to increase value without increasing acquisition costs. It turns each customer into a long-term asset. And over time, that creates a compounding effect. A different type of commitment. When someone becomes a member, they are making a different decision. They are not just buying a solution. They are committing to a process. That commitment creates deeper engagement. and deeper engagement creates more opportunity. The natural next step. Once a customer is engaged consistently and receiving value over time, something else begins to happen. They start talking about it. They share their experience. They mention your name. They bring others into the conversation. This is where growth accelerates again, because now the system is not just retaining customers, it is generating new ones. Where this leads. Recurring revenue stabilizes growth, but it also unlocks the next level. Because once customers are engaged, connected, and receiving value, they become a source of new opportunity, not by chance, but by design. And that is where we go next. Because referrals are not something that happens, they are something you build. Chapter 33, Referrals as a System. Most businesses treat referrals as something that happens. A customer has a good experience. They mention your name. Someone new comes in, and when it happens, it feels like a bonus. The problem with this thinking, referrals are not luck. They are a result. When the system is working, referrals are not occasional. They are predictable. But most businesses never experience that. Not because customers are unwilling, but because nothing in the process makes referrals easy or expected. Why referrals don't happen. Even satisfied customers do not always refer. Not because they don't value what you do, but because they are busy, they forget, they hesitate, they are unsure how to introduce you. Without structure, intention fades. Referrals come from engagement. There's a common assumption that referrals come from satisfaction. They don't. They come from engagement. A satisfied customer may say positive things. An engaged customer takes action. They feel connected. They see ongoing value. They want others to experience the same. This is why referrals sit higher on the ladder of loyalty. The stronger the relationship, the more likely the customer is to contribute. Designing the system, if you want consistent referrals, you must design for them, not hope for them. That starts with removing friction. Make it simple. Clear ways to introduce you. Clear language to use. Clear next steps once the introduction is made. When the process is easy, it happens. When it is unclear, it doesn't. Making it natural. The next step is expectation. Referrals should not feel like an extra request. It should feel like a natural extension of the relationship. At the right moment, when value has been delivered and trust is strong, the conversation can shift, not as a pitch, but as a question. Who else do you know who would benefit from this? Is there someone in your network facing a similar challenge? These are not sales questions. They are connection questions. They invite the customer to think beyond themselves. Recognition reinforces behavior. When someone refers, it must be acknowledged, not just processed, appreciated, because recognition reinforces behavior. When customers see that their referrals matter, they are more likely to do it again. This does not always require incentives. Often, acknowledgement is enough. What matters is that it is visible. Consistency creates predictability. Referrals cannot be occasional. They must be part of the system, built into conversations, built into follow-up, built into the overall experience. When referrals are designed this way, something changes. They become predictable. Not every customer will refer, but enough will. And over time, that creates a steady flow of new opportunities. The quality of referred customers. Referred customers are different. They arrive with trust. They arrive with context. They arrive with confidence. They are not starting from zero. This shortens the conversion process, reduces resistance, and increases conversion rates. The system feeds itself. This is where the real power appears. A strong system creates loyal customers. Loyal customers create referrals. Referrals create new opportunities. And those opportunities enter the conversion engine already aligned. This is where growth becomes self-sustaining, from effort to multiplication. At this point, something shifts. Growth is no longer driven purely by effort. It is driven by structure. You are no longer relying only on marketing or outbound. You are building a system where your existing relationships generate future opportunities. This is multiplication. Where this leads, once referrals are working, the system becomes powerful. But there's another layer that increases its effectiveness even further. Speed, consistency, scale. This is where technology begins to play a role. Because while the principles of conversion remain the same, the way they are executed is evolving. And those who understand that evolution gain a significant advantage. That's where we go next. Part 9, AI and the future of conversion. The fundamentals of buying haven't changed, but the environment has. Technology will continue to update and change, but it is accelerating speed, increasing complexity, and reshaping expectations. This is where the businesses that combine human understanding with system-driven execution gain the advantage, because the future belongs to those who adapt. Chapter 34, AI-Powered Conversion. The fundamentals of conversion do not change. People still decide based on trust, clarity, and confidence. They still move through stages of thinking. They still respond to relevance, timing, and understanding. What is changing is the environment those decisions happen in. AI does not replace conversion. There's a common misconception that AI will replace sales. It won't, because conversion is not just about information. It is about understanding. And understanding is human. What AI actually changes. AI does not change how people decide. It changes how quickly and consistently the process can operate. For the first time, businesses can run parts of their conversion process continuously, not just during working hours, not just when a salesperson is available, but all the time. Speed becomes standard. We've already seen how important speed of response is. Being present in the moment of intent creates a significant advantage. AI makes that possible at scale. A prospect reaches out and receives an immediate response. A question is asked and answered without delay. The conversation begins instantly. This keeps momentum alive. Without it, opportunities often fade before they begin. Consistency without compromise. One of the biggest challenges in conversion is inconsistency. Different people respond differently. Some follow up well, others don't. Some ask the right questions, others miss them. AI reduces that variation. It ensures that the fundamentals are always executed. Responses happen, follow-up continues. Information is delivered clearly. This creates a stable foundation. Human effort moves up the value chain. When AI handles repetition, human effort becomes more valuable. Instead of spending time on basic responses, salespeople can focus on what matters. Understanding the customer, diagnosing the problem, guiding the decision, the parts of the process that create real impact. Personalization at scale. AI also changes how communication is delivered. It allows messaging to adapt based on behavior, based on interaction, based on context. This makes every interaction feel more relevant, and relevance is what drives engagement. Smarter qualification. Not every prospect is ready. Some are early in the process. Some are exploring. Some are not a fit. AI can help identify where someone sits. It can guide early-stage conversations, ask structured questions, gather information. This allows you to focus attention where it matters most and on prospects that matter the most. The balance that matters. There is an important balance to maintain. AI can accelerate the system, but it cannot replace understanding. It can support, it can assist, it can train and role play, it can enhance. But the core of conversion remains human, recognizing the gap, understanding the situation, guiding the decision. These require judgment. The businesses that win. The businesses that succeed with AI will not be the ones that replace people. They will be the ones that strengthen their people and their system, automating what can be automated, and focusing human effort where it creates the most value. The new standard. The future of conversion is not either or. It is both. Speed and understanding, structure and flexibility, technology and human judgment. Together, they create a system that is faster, more consistent, and more effective than anything that existed before. Where this leads. As AI changes how businesses operate, it also changes how customers behave. They have more access to information, more ways to explore, more ways to compare. But more information does not always create clarity. In many cases, it creates the opposite, confusion, and that changes what the buyer needs. Not more information, but more structure, more guidance, more clarity. This is where the next shift happens. Because the buyer is evolving and understanding that evolution is critical. That's where we go next. Chapter 35, the new buyer. The tools have changed. The environment has changed. And as a result, the buyer has changed. More information, less clarity. Today's customer has access to more information than ever before. They can search instantly, compare options, read reviews, watch explanations, ask their network, and increasingly, they ask AI. On the surface, this should make decisions easier, but it often does the opposite. More information does not always create clarity. It creates complexity, the paradox of choice. With more options comes more uncertainty, more perspectives, more opinions, more conflicting information. The modern buyer is not struggling with lack of access. They are struggling with overload. They can find answers, but they struggle to decide which answers matter. The illusion of confidence. This creates a new kind of buyer, more informed, but not always more certain. They arrive with knowledge, but also with doubt. They understand the landscape, but not always how to navigate it. Why traditional selling fails. This is where many businesses misread the situation. They assume that because the buyer is informed, the decision should be easier. So they provide more information, more detail, more explanation, more content. But information is not what the buyer needs. Clarity is. The role has changed. The modern buyer does not need someone to explain what exists. They need someone to help them make sense of it, to filter what matters, to simplify complexity, to provide structure. This is where your role becomes critical, not as a source of information, but as a guide through it. Independence versus guidance. Today's buyer values independence. They want to explore on their own terms. They want to feel in control, but they also value expertise. They want someone who can help them avoid mistakes, someone who understands what works, someone who can bring clarity to confusion. This creates a balance. Too much control creates resistance. Too little guidance creates uncertainty. The most effective approach sits between the two. Where you fit, the buyer may begin alone, researching, comparing, exploring. At some point, they reach a limit. They need to validate, they need to confirm, they need to decide. This is where you enter. Not to restart the process, but to continue it. Trust has shifted. Trust is no longer built only in conversation. It is built before it, through what the buyer sees, your presence, your content, your reputation. By the time they engage with you, trust is already forming. Or it isn't. Consistency matters more than ever. If what they see externally does not match what they experience directly, trust breaks. If it aligns, trust strengthens. Every touch point matters because the buyer is connecting them. Speed and variation. The modern buyer also moves differently. Some move quickly. They identify a need and act. Others move slowly. They explore, compare, and delay. Both are normal. The mistake is forcing one pace. The advantage is supporting both. Participation is expected. The buyer is no longer passive. They expect to engage, to interact, to contribute, to explore. This is why tools, structured conversations, and guided decisions are so effective. They match how the buyer now behaves. The shift that defines everything. This is the evolution. From being sold to being guided. From receiving information to making sense of it. From passive involvement to active participation. Where this leads, understanding the buyer is not enough. You must respond to them. Adapt your process. Align your approach. Structure your system. Because everything you have learned in this book only creates value when it is applied. And that is where we go next. Because the conversion engine is not something you read. It is something you build. And building it requires one final step. Installation. Part 10, installation. Understanding the system is not enough. It must be built. This is where ideas become action, and action becomes results. Because once the conversion engine is installed, growth stops being unpredictable and starts becoming intentional. Chapter 36. Installing your conversion engine. Understanding the conversion engine is one thing. Installing it is another. Most people will read ideas like this, agree with them, and then return to doing what they have always done. Not because they don't see the value, but because they don't translate the thinking into action. A system only works when it is built. The reality of implementation. You do not install a system all at once. You build it step by step, layer by layer, and each layer strengthens the next. Step 1. See what actually exists. The first step is clarity, not theory, reality. You need to see your current process as it actually is. Not how you think it works, not how you want it to work, but how it really operates today. Where do prospects enter? How do you respond? What happens next? Where do conversations go? Where do they stop? This is where most of the insight sits. Because the gaps are already there. They just haven't been mapped. Step 2, define the structure. Once you can see the process, you can structure it. Define the stages clearly. Entry, engagement, diagnosis, guidance, conversion, nurture, expansion. Make them real. What happens at each stage? What must always happen? What cannot be missed? This is where you move from activity to design. Step 3, build the tools. Now you support the process, not with more explanation, but with structure. You do not need everything at once. Start with what matters most. A clear way to respond, a structured set of questions, a simple way to present options, a consistent follow-up approach. Each tool strengthens the system. Step 4, create the framework. This is where scripting comes in, not rigid scripts, but clear frameworks. What do you say at the beginning? What questions do you always ask? How do you guide the decision? This creates consistency, and consistency creates results. Step 5, apply discipline. A system only works when it is used. This is where most efforts fail. Not because the system is wrong, but because it is not applied consistently. Respond every time. Ask the right questions every time. Follow up every time, not occasionally, consistently. This is what turns process into performance. Step 6, measure what matters. Once the system is in place, you track it. Where do prospects enter? Where do they move? Where do they slow down? This is where improvement begins. Small adjustments, clear insights, continuous refinement. Over time, the system becomes stronger. Step 7, align the team. If you have a team, this is where scale happens. Everyone must operate from the same structure. Not the same personality, not the same style, but the same system. This ensures that every prospect experiences the same level of clarity, and that consistency builds trust from effort to system. At this point, something changes. Conversion stops feeling unpredictable. It becomes manageable. You can see where improvement is needed. You can focus effort. You can build momentum. Growth becomes easier, not because the market changed, but because your system did. The compounding effect. The more consistently the system is applied, the more it improves. Conversations become clearer. Decisions become faster. Results become more predictable. This is where leverage appears, because now the system is working for you. Where this leads. Once the conversion engine is installed, your role changes. You're no longer chasing opportunities. You're managing a system that produces them. And that is a different position entirely. Because at that point, selling is no longer about effort. It is about structure. And that structure is what defines the future of selling. That's where we go next. Chapter 37, the future of selling. Selling is not disappearing, but it is changing. The end of the old model. For years, success in sales was tied to individuals. The best talkers, the best closers, the most persuasive. Results depended on talent, and talent is difficult to scale. The shift to systems. The future of selling belongs to systems, not scripts alone, not tools alone, but structured processes that guide decisions. Systems that create clarity. Systems that reduce friction. Systems that move people forward. The individual still matters, but they operate within the system from effort to structure. This is the shift. Instead of relying on effort, businesses rely on structure. Instead of chasing outcomes, they build processes that produce them. Instead of hoping conversations go well, they design them to work. Trust has replaced persuasion. Customers no longer respond to pressure. They respond to confidence. Confidence built through understanding. through consistency, through clarity. This is why guidance has replaced control. A new role for sales. The role of the salesperson has changed. It is no longer to push. It is to help, to ask better questions, to provide better structure, to create better decisions. This is where real value is created. Technology accelerates the shift. Technology is not replacing this process. It is accelerating it. AI, automation, and digital tools remove friction. They increase speed. They improve consistency. But they do not replace the core, because the core remains human. Understanding, judgment, guidance. The advantage goes to the aligned. The businesses that win will combine both. Technology for efficiency, people for understanding, structure for consistency. This creates a system that is faster, clearer, and more effective than anything that came before. The conversion engine as the foundation. This is where the conversion engine sits, not as a tactic, not as a technique, but as the operating system for modern growth. It connects everything: marketing and sales, inbound and outbound, short-term decisions and long-term value. It creates alignment. When alignment exists, when everything is aligned, something important happens. Conversion becomes easier, not because you're working harder, but because the system is working for you. The final shift. This is the future of selling. Not more pressure, not more activity, better systems, systems that guide decisions, systems that create clarity, systems that turn attention into action and action into long-term value. What happens next? At this point, there's only one thing left: action. Because understanding the system does not change your results. Building it does. Start with 2 weeks free coaching. Listening to this book will change how you think. Applying it will change your results. The conversion engine is not something you understand once. It is something you build. And like any system, it becomes more powerful when it is implemented with guidance. If you are serious about improving your conversion, start simple. 2 weeks. 2 weeks of focused attention on your business. Looking at your process, identifying the gaps, installing the structure. This is not theory. This is application. Because the fastest way to improve conversion is not to just learn more. It is to implement what you learn. If you are ready to move from understanding to action, start there. Because once the conversion engine is in place, everything changes. Your conversations improve. Your confidence increases. Your results grow. And most importantly, your business becomes predictable, profitable, and scalable. That is what the system is designed to create. Now it's your move. Come join us at actioncoach.com.